In the grand theatre of European royalty, kings are usually born to project majesty, the gilded cradles, the trumpets, the reassuring sense that yes, this tiny baby will one day wear a crown without it slipping over his ears. Then there was Charles II of Spain, born in 1661, who looked less like the future of an empire and more like the awkward punchline to his family's long-running genetic joke. His subjects called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched, and while nicknames for monarchs often erred toward flattering the great, the wise, the magnificent, Charles's nickname was basically the 17th century version of saying, "Yikes, something's not right here." From the moment he entered the world, Charles was more medical mystery than monarch in training. He was sickly, fragile, and prone to illnesses that made palace doctors sharpen their quills in panic. Walking, that came late. Talking, also late. Growing into a healthy young ruler, never happened. Imagine waiting for your iPhone to finish an update, only to realize it froze halfway and will never function properly again. That was Charles, Spain's permanently loading screen of a king. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, the cursed Spanish king who couldn't chew his food, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Now, the most infamous feature of Charles was his jaw, the notorious Habsburg jaw. This wasn't just an overbite, the kind an orthodontist might frown at while recommending braces. Charles's lower jaw jutted so far forward and hung so slack that he couldn't chew food properly. Meals weren't feasts, they were tests of endurance. Chewing bread was like asking him to perform advanced physics. Soup became his safest friend. To make things worse, his tongue was so large and unwieldy that speaking clearly was a royal battle in itself. Courtiers had to strain their ears to interpret the royal mumbling, which meant Spain's most powerful orders sometimes sounded like garbled half-sentences. Imagine trying to run an empire when your king's speeches came across as blah blah cough cough maybe war. And yet, as tragic as his personal condition was, Charles was less the victim of fate and more the unlucky end product of centuries of strategic cousin collecting. For generations, the Spanish Habsburgs believed the best way to keep the throne in the family was, quite literally, to keep everything in the family. They married cousins, uncles, nieces, and occasionally looped back around just to make sure the bloodline stayed pure. But purity in this case meant genetic roulette at its worst. By the time Charles was born, the Habsburgs weren't just rolling snake eyes, they'd lost the dice, the table, and possibly the casino. Charles was their final jackpot. A boy with the combined genetic errors of a dynasty, too stubborn to look outside the family tree. Modern geneticists who studied his family history concluded he had more overlap in his DNA than the average child of siblings. In other words, Charles didn't just inherit the crown, he inherited every possible glitch coded into his family's DNA. Imagine a dynasty treating marriage like recycling, and you get Charles, Europe's most tragic eco-friendly experiment, course. In 1661, no one was running DNA tests or discussing recessive genes. Instead, people saw his condition as proof of supernatural interference. Thus the nickname El Hechizado. Was he cursed? Bewitched? Possessed? Probably not. But when your king looks like a man who accidentally wandered out of a medieval woodcut about demons, rumors fly fast. The Spanish court was filled with whispers that witches or devils had placed a curse on the boy. In truth, the only curse Charles had was a family tree that folded in on itself like badly done origami. But let's not forget, Charles wasn't just a curiosity for the physicians and gossips. He was king. By law, by birth, by sheer inertia of tradition, he inherited Spain's throne at just 4 years old. Picture it, a fragile toddler, barely able to stand upright, suddenly made ruler of one of the world's largest empires. Spain's dominions stretched from Europe to the Americas to parts of Asia. The fate of millions rested on a boy who needed help getting out of bed in the morning. It's as if someone gave a toddler the nuclear codes and said, "Good luck, champ." His presence at court was both pitied and revered. On one hand, courtiers saw the frail, awkward figure who drooled, struggled to eat, and looked perpetually exhausted. On the other, he was still king, God's chosen ruler on earth, or so everyone desperately told themselves. To question Charles's right to rule was to question divine will, and no one wanted to risk divine lightning bolts. So Spain soldiered on, pretending their ruler wasn't physically and mentally collapsing before their eyes. Charles's very existence was both a medical case study and a political liability. His health, or lack thereof, was Spain's open secret. Other European powers knew he was fragile, knew the dynasty was running out of heirs, and knew that sooner or later Spain's future would be up for grabs. But in this first chapter of his life, before the wars, before the dynastic crises, Charles stood, or rather slumped, as a symbol of how far unchecked dynastic ambition could push human biology. In short, Charles II was not your typical monarch. He wasn't a warrior king striding into battle. He wasn't a philosopher king, pondering deep truths. He wasn't even a playboy king, chasing mistresses around the palace. He was a boy born broken by history, crowned by tradition, and carried along by the inertia of his dynasty. Imagine being born as Europe's grand finale genetic experiment. Spoiler, it didn't end well. If Charles II of Spain was the grand finale, then the fireworks show that led up to him was centuries of Habsburgs refusing to marry outside their own cousin-filled backyard. The dynasty had one ironclad rule: don't share power with strangers when you can share it with your aunt. That might sound like a bold political strategy, but biologically it was a slow-motion disaster. Let's rewind a few hundred years. The House of Habsburg started in the chilly Swiss Alps, where they were just another ambitious medieval clan, but through clever marriages, they slowly hit the jackpot. By the 15th century, they had a catchy motto: "Let others wage wars, you, happy Austria, marry." It worked. They stitched together a continental empire by swapping rings instead of swinging swords. Why fight when you could just marry your neighbor's heir and inherit their land once they coughed themselves into the grave? But here's the catch. After a while, the pool of eligible royals got, let's say, shallow. And when you insist on keeping everything in the family, sooner or later, your weddings start to look less like diplomacy and more like awkward reunions at Thanksgiving. The Habsburgs became champions of the intra-family marriage game. Cousin with cousin, done. Uncle with niece, also done. Sometimes marriages were arranged between people who were double cousins, meaning they were related through both parents. Think about that. Your family reunion ends with half the guests holding marriage contracts instead of paper plates. It's less a family tree than a wreath, neat, circular, and strangling itself in the process. Now, to really understand how extreme this got, let's look at Charles's own ancestry. Modern genetic studies have shown that over 9 generations of Habsburgs, marriages almost exclusively occurred between relatives. Charles II's father, Philip IV, married his niece. Yes, his niece. That makes Charles the product of an uncle-niece match, which is about as close genetically as you can legally get without violating more than one moral code at once. Here's the shocking part. When geneticists calculated Charles's pedigree, they found that more than 80% of his DNA came from just a handful of ancestors. To put that into perspective, you probably have more unique genetic input from your great-grandparents than Charles did from centuries of monarchs. His family tree was so folded in on itself that you could basically draw it with a compass and be accurate. And this wasn't an accident, it was strategy. The Habsburgs were obsessed with dynastic purity. They believed that marrying outsiders was risky because outsiders brought competing claims and messy politics. Better to keep it in-house, even if it meant ignoring the doctor in the corner, politely clearing his throat and muttering, "This is going to end badly." And end badly it did. By Charles's time, the effects of all this inbreeding weren't hypothetical, they were painfully visible. Generations of narrowed gene pools had already produced Habsburgs with jutting jaws, fertility problems, and a reputation for being a little let's say less sharp upstairs. Charles wasn't an outlier. He was the inevitable result of a dynasty that had turned its DNA into an echo chamber. But let's not get too bogged down in the grim science, because the Habsburg family's dedication to this policy also produced some downright absurd family connections. For example, Charles's mother was also his father's niece, which made her both his mother and his cousin. Imagine trying to fill that out on a family tree diagram. You'd run out of arrows and start needing explanatory footnotes. It gets even more ridiculous when you zoom out. At one point, the Habsburgs of Austria and Spain were marrying back and forth so often that it's hard to tell where one branch ended and the other began. It's like a medieval soap opera, except instead of who's dating whom, the question was who's marrying their uncle this season. Historians like to point out the inbreeding coefficient of Charles II, a number that measures how closely related your parents are. The average person today has a coefficient close to 0. Children of siblings or parent-child relationships hit 25%. Charles's inbreeding coefficient, an eye-watering 25.4%, meaning he was technically more inbred than the child of a brother-sister marriage. That's not just alarming, that's Guinness World Record alarming. Now, here's where it gets almost darkly comedic. The Habsburgs thought they were being clever by ensuring their lands stayed in the family. But what they really did was set up a slow-burning, dynasty-ending time bomb. They preserved the throne, yes, but also created a king who couldn't chew, speak clearly, or produce an heir. It's as if they spent centuries carefully tying knots in their own shoelaces, only to hand the empire to someone who couldn't walk. And while other royal families occasionally dipped into the cousin pool, no one committed quite like the Habsburgs. They were in it for the long haul. Centuries of keep it in the family finally ended with Charles, a monarch whose body was essentially a medical catalogue of everything that could go wrong with too much DNA recycling. So when people whispered that Charles was cursed, they weren't entirely wrong, but the curse wasn't witchcraft or demons. It was centuries of stubborn matrimonial bookkeeping, the kind that ignored biology in favor of politics. The Habsburgs had married themselves into a corner, and Charles was the proof that the corner was collapsing. As one historian dryly put it, the Habsburg dynasty showed the world that you can marry for power all you like, but eventually power can't outrun chromosomes, or, to put it less academically, when your family reunions look like awkward wedding receptions, you know trouble's brewing. If most royal childhoods read like fairy tales filled with tutors, banquets, and the occasional pony, then Charles II's childhood was more like a ghost story. Born in 1661, the boy who would be king didn't toddle through gilded halls with a wooden sword in hand. Instead, he shuffled, wheezed, and coughed his way through a palace where the most exciting playdate usually involved a priest, a physician, or sometimes both arguing over whether his latest problem was medical or demonic. From the beginning, Charles's development was painfully delayed. He didn't learn to walk until he was about 4 years old, and even then it was with the shaky determination of a man learning ice skating at 50. Talking wasn't much better. Words came late, were slurred when they arrived, and often left courtiers pretending they understood. For Spain's ruling elite, this wasn't just awkward family drama. This was the future of the empire reduced to babbling like a toddler long past the age when one should be babbling. And what did the court do in response? Did they rush in with the best doctors and educational programs available? Technically, yes, but this was the 17th century, which meant best doctors often meant people who thought leeches were personality enhancers and who believed half of life's problems could be solved with a timely bleeding. The physicians diagnosed him with everything under the sun, while priests whispered that his condition was the work of curses, devils, or some witch who had it out for Spain. Exorcisms were suggested, and occasionally carried out, as though Latin chanting might suddenly fix the boy's inability to pronounce Latin words. The result was a palace environment less like a nursery and more like a live-in hospital ward, with occasional detours into a haunted house. Instead of toys and tutors, Charles was surrounded by anxious adults waving crucifixes, mixing potions and checking his pulse with an intensity usually reserved for last rites. You can almost picture little Charles looking around and wondering why everyone else got wooden horses while he got another round of holy water splashed in his face. His education didn't improve matters. Charles wasn't groomed for rule the way earlier Habsburg princes had been. He had no rigorous training in statecraft, no intellectual drilling in law or governance. Instead, he was largely left uneducated, shielded from strain by a court, terrified that thinking too hard might literally kill him. His tutors realized quickly that he couldn't handle much beyond the basics. So the future ruler of one of the world's most sprawling empires was effectively treated like a fragile porcelain doll, admired, protected, and never actually used. When it came to politics, Charles's understanding was minimal at best. Decisions were made for him, lessons skipped or watered down. He learned about governance the way most of us learned advanced algebra, staring at it blankly, hoping it would one day make sense, then giving up when it didn't. He learned politics the way you learn math, by staring at the numbers until they go away. And this lack of education wasn't just personal misfortune, it was a national problem. Spain was already dealing with financial difficulties, declining influence, and enemies circling like sharks. The country desperately needed a sharp, decisive monarch to turn things around. What it got instead was a boy who had never been taught how to rule, raised in an environment where even basic decisions like what he should eat were filtered through committees of worried adults. His sheltered upbringing also made him vulnerable. Courtiers, priests, and doctors all competed for influence over him, shaping his worldview in ways that served their interests more than his. If you grow up being told you're cursed, fragile, and unfit for stress, chances are you'll start to believe it. Charles became deeply superstitious, easily manipulated, and convinced that forces beyond his control shaped his life. And when you've spent your childhood being exercised instead of educated, who could blame him? The irony is that while Charles lacked a normal childhood, he was still treated with all the pomp due a king. He had gilded rooms, ornate clothing, and endless ceremonies honoring his royal position. But the trappings of majesty couldn't disguise the reality. Here was a boy who couldn't run through the gardens, who couldn't laugh easily with companions, and who couldn't even chew his food properly without risk of choking. His palace was golden, but it was also a cage, one padded with superstition, paranoia, and the suffocating weight of expectations he would never fulfill. It's tempting to imagine what might have happened if Charles had been raised differently, if he had been given an education suited to his abilities, or if the court had focused on his strengths instead of obsessing over his weaknesses. But history doesn't deal in what-ifs. The reality is that Charles's childhood was one long exercise in fragility management. Every cough was a crisis, every stumble a scandal, and every attempt at learning overshadowed by the fear that it might be too much for him. So while other royal children learned fencing, languages, or the art of war, Charles learned how to sit quietly while someone sprinkled holy water over his bed. While others were prepared to lead armies, he was taught to survive another day without collapsing. And while most kings grew into their crowns, Charles never really grew into his own body, let alone his empire. In the end, his childhood set the tone for the rest of his reign. A boy who never became a man, a king who never learned to rule, and a dynasty that never learned the limits of its own ambitions. His youth wasn't a training ground, it was a waiting room, where everyone sat nervously, hoping the fragile boy king would make it to adulthood. Spoiler, he did, but whether Spain was better off for it, well, that's another chapter. Being sick in the 1600s was already a gamble. Even if you were healthy, a doctor could show up, bleed you half to death, and congratulate himself for saving your life. Now imagine being Charles II of Spain, a frail king, with an entire royal court of physicians, priests, and gossiping nobles determined to fix him. Spoiler, they didn't. They tried everything from cutting-edge science, which usually meant sticking leeches on inconvenient body parts, to medieval-style exorcisms that looked like auditions for a horror movie. The result? A royal medical history that reads less like treatment and more like experimental theatre. First, the doctors. The Spanish court employed a rotating cast of physicians who all came armed with their favorite miracle cures, potions, purges, bleeding, poultices, you name it. Charles endured it. The prevailing belief was that the body's health relied on balancing its humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If Charles looked pale, clearly his blood needed reducing. If he was sluggish, out came a potion designed to induce vomiting. If he coughed, there was probably too much phlegm, and the solution was to purge it by making him swallow something that smelled like a potion a witch would reject. These treatments weren't just ineffective, they were exhausting. Every time Charles sneezed, some court doctor prepared to drain half his veins or shove a bitter tonic down his throat. At one point, he was subjected to regular enemas because apparently the medical consensus was that all royal problems could be solved from the back end. If wellness retreats had existed in his time, Charles's would have been advertised as bleeding, vomiting, and enemas, a holistic experience. But medicine wasn't the only option, because where science failed, superstition swooped in to offer its services. The Spanish court was buzzing with gossip about witches, curses, and demonic interference. Charles wasn't just frail, people whispered. He was bewitched. This idea gained so much traction that even educated nobles took it seriously. His deteriorating health, his inability to father children, his perpetual exhaustion, surely this wasn't biology. Surely this was black magic. And so the exorcisms began. Multiple attempts were made to rid Charles of the evil supposedly clinging to him. Picture it, the King of Spain, ruler of half the known world, sitting stiffly in his chambers while priests chanted Latin, splashed holy water, and held crucifixes over his bed. Courtiers would stand by, solemn and wide-eyed, as if the devil himself might leap out of Charles's body at any second. In reality, the only thing leaping was Charles's patience. One particularly bizarre exorcism involved spreading blessed oil across his chest and reciting prayers until Charles supposedly coughed up the curse. Spoiler, he coughed up phlegm, not demons. Another ritual required placing relics of saints around him while priests demanded Satan reveal himself. Unsurprisingly, Satan did not RSVP to this event, yet these ceremonies were repeated, sometimes in public, as reassurance that anything was being done about the king's condition. The irony, of course, is that Charles was both the most medically attended monarch in Europe and the most spiritually treated, and neither group managed to improve his health. Doctors saw him as a fascinating puzzle. Priests saw him as a supernatural battlefield. To Charles, it must have felt like being a guinea pig stuck in a tug-of-war between Hogwarts and a butcher shop. And the gossip didn't stop there. Rumours swirled about who might have cursed the king. Some blamed foreign queens, others blamed rival nobles, and a few pointed fingers at France, Spain's eternal frenemy. Imagine being sick and having people whisper that the reason you can't digest your food isn't genetics or illness. It's because some woman in Paris stuck pins in a doll that looks suspiciously like you. For Charles, every ache became proof of witchcraft, every fever a sign that the devil was pulling strings. This environment of paranoia only worsened his mental state. He grew convinced that he was cursed, that invisible forces were conspiring against him. Instead of confidence, he developed dependency on priests, on healers, on anyone who claimed they could fix him. It was a vicious cycle. The more fragile he looked, the more superstitions flourished, and the more superstitions flourished, the less anyone tried to address the actual medical problems. Meanwhile, the medical records piled up with bizarre remedies. One doctor recommended powdered human skull as a treatment. Another tried goat's milk baths, because apparently someone decided lactose intolerance wasn't enough of a problem. Royal physicians mixed concoctions of herbs, minerals, and sometimes downright toxic ingredients in the hope that something would stick. You almost get the sense they weren't curing Charles so much as daring him to survive their recipes. The sad truth is that none of this helped. Charles remained weak, sickly, and increasingly despondent. Every treatment became a performance, every exorcism a reminder that even his own court thought the devil had him on speed dial. In a world where medicine was half guesswork and half superstition, Charles ended up caught between both, drained by doctors and haunted by priests, with no real relief from either side. If royal marriages are supposed to be the engines that drive dynasties forward, then Charles II of Spain's marriage record was more like a carriage with square wheels, noisy, awkward, and ultimately going nowhere. He was married not once but twice, first to the elegant French princess Marie-Louise of Orléans, and later to the German-born Maria Anna of Neuburg. In both cases, the royal wedding bells rang loudly, but the cradle stayed tragically and politically empty. For Spain, this was a full-blown crisis. Dynasties don't just thrive on pomp and ceremony, they survive on heirs, and Charles, last male of the Spanish Habsburg line, had exactly one job: produce children who would carry the family torch. Unfortunately, biology, genetics, and a lifetime of fragile health had stacked the deck against him. Spain wanted an heir. Charles couldn't even produce an heirloom. Let's start with wife number 1, Marie-Louise of Orléans, niece of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. By all accounts, Marie-Louise was lively, beautiful, and full of the kind of French sparkle that made Spanish courtiers squint suspiciously. She married Charles in 1679 when she was just 17 years old, a teenager swept from the glittering French court into the far more rigid, etiquette-heavy world of Madrid. Her new husband? Not exactly the romantic lead she might have hoped for. Charles was frail, awkward, and often too ill to function as a husband, much less as the father of a future dynasty. But Marie-Louise did try. She dutifully appeared at court functions, offered Charles affection, and by all accounts genuinely cared for him. The problem was, after 10 years of marriage, there were no children. The blame, of course, fell entirely on her at first. The Spanish court, already nervous about foreign influence, muttered that the French bride must have brought a curse, or that she simply wasn't trying hard enough. But the reality was that Charles's own health made conception nearly impossible. His physical deformities, combined with likely impotence and sterility, meant the odds of producing heirs were slimmer than a royal waistline stuffed into 17th century corsetry. Marie-Louise bore the brunt of it. She was accused of negligence, whispered about in corridors, and even suspected of magical sabotage. The pressure was enormous, and she spiraled into despair. Her early death at 26 was officially blamed on appendicitis, though many contemporaries whispered it was the result of heartbreak, stress, or even poison, because in royal courts, poison was always the fashionable explanation, whether natural or not. Her passing left Charles widowed, heirless, and the Spanish throne teetering on a dynastic cliff. Which brings us to wife number 2, Maria Anna of Neuburg. If Marie-Louise had been chosen to cement ties with France, Maria Anna was a strategic play to strengthen alliances with the German states. Married to Charles in 1690, she came with a family reputation for remarkable fertility. Her sisters had produced an impressive brood of children across Europe. If any woman could coax an heir out of Charles, surely it was Maria Anna. Except no. Despite high hopes, the second marriage was as childless as the first. Maria Anna quickly realized her husband's health was far worse than advertised. Charles was frequently too weak for marital duties, and when attempts were made, they ended in frustration. Rumors circulated that the king's attempts at consummation were so unsuccessful that physicians were occasionally called in as advisors, like grim referees at the world's least entertaining sporting match. Maria Anna, unlike her predecessor, adapted by becoming politically ambitious. With no children to secure her position, she sought influence through court intrigue, aligning herself with factions and attempting to control policy. This made her widely unpopular. Where Marie-Louise had been pitied as a tragic young queen, Maria Anna was resented as a schemer. To Charles, already overwhelmed by illness and paranoia, this likely only deepened his misery. Meanwhile, Spain grew increasingly desperate. Every passing year without an heir was another nail in the coffin of the Habsburg dynasty. Nobles whispered, foreign powers watched hungrily, and the looming question of succession hovered like a storm cloud. The king's personal tragedy had become a geopolitical nightmare, and yet, despite all the political calculations, the core truth remained painfully simple. Charles wanted to be a father. contemporary letters reveal his sadness, his yearning for children that never came. In a court where his every failure was magnified, this one must have cut deepest. He knew his line was ending with him, and that his marriages so full of pomp, pageantry and pressure had delivered nothing but silence in the royal nursery. It's almost Shakespearean in its futility. Two queens, both young, both pressured, both burdened with impossible expectations. One broken by grief, the other hardened by politics. And at the center, a king whose body betrayed him, leaving Spain not with heirs, but with years of dynastic anxiety and a throne destined to become the prize of Europe's next great war. So what do we call this chapter in Charles's tragic life? A tale of love? A story of politics? A dynastic disaster? Probably all three. But above all, it's the story of a man who carried the hopes of an empire on his shoulders, yet could never carry a child in his arms. Spain wanted an heir. Charles couldn't even produce an heirloom. When you think of a king, you imagine someone steering the ship of state, a steady hand on the wheel, eyes fixed on the horizon, maybe shouting a heroic Viva España as the sails billow proudly. Under Charles II, however, the Spanish ship of state wasn't being steered at all. It was drifting, aimlessly, and sometimes directly into rocks. Imagine leaving your country on airplane mode for 35 years. That was Spain under Charles. Charles was king in name, but in practice he was more of a hood ornament for the battered old jalopy of the Spanish Empire. The real driving was done by regents, ministers, and whichever ambitious noble happened to be closest to the throne that week. Spain didn't have one ruler. It had a constant carousel of power brokers, each jockeying to squeeze the last drops of wealth and influence out of an empire already bleeding from every orifice. Let's be clear, Spain wasn't in peak condition even before Charles came along. The glory days of the 16th century, when conquistadors dumped shiploads of silver from the Americas and the Armada was supposed to terrify England, were long gone. By the late 17th century, the silver was running out. England was very much unterrified, and Spain was basically the European version of that one uncle who keeps talking about his glory days while borrowing money for rent. Economically, Spain was in freefall. The influx of New World silver, once the crown's greatest treasure, had led to runaway inflation. The coins jingling in Spanish pockets were worth less and less, like a cursed economic magic trick. Agriculture lagged behind. Trade routes were increasingly dominated by rivals like the Dutch and the English, and taxes crushed what little productivity was left. Spain's economy was like a medieval piñata, already cracked open, and everyone else was grabbing the candy. Militarily, things weren't any brighter. The Spanish army, once the terror of Europe, had degenerated into underpaid, underfed regiments that spent more time rioting for wages than fighting battles. The navy, meanwhile, was a shadow of its former self, so weak that pirates sometimes had better equipped ships. When your empire stretches across oceans, but your fleet can barely scare off a fishing boat, that's not strategy, that's comedy. Meanwhile, the colonies, those glittering overseas possessions that had bankrolled Spain's might for a century, were starting to slip. Local elites in the Americas grew resentful of Madrid's heavy taxes and incompetent governance. Trade smuggling flourished, often with the enthusiastic help of England and France, who were more than happy to nibble away at Spain's crumbling monopoly. Imagine trying to keep a global empire together with a king who could barely keep his shoes tied. It didn't go well. Inside Spain, the absence of strong leadership created a power vacuum. Courtiers, nobles, and even the queen consorts, remember Maria Anna from the last chapter, all competed to steer the country. The result wasn't governance so much as endless squabbling. Ministers rose and fell in quick succession, each one blaming the last for Spain's decline while failing to stop the rot themselves. The palace corridors were less a seat of government than a particularly vicious game of musical chairs, and because Charles himself was often too sick or too mentally unfit to intervene, his signature on royal decrees meant little. He might technically approve a decision, but it was usually because someone put the document in front of him and told him where to sign. Spain wasn't being ruled, it was being managed by committee. And as anyone who's ever sat through a committee meeting knows, that's a recipe for chaos. The common people, meanwhile, bore the brunt of all this dysfunction. Heavy taxation, food shortages, and widespread poverty left Spain's peasants miserable. Famines swept through regions where once fertile fields now stood neglected. Disease was rampant, social mobility non-existent. For ordinary Spaniards, the empire's golden age might as well have been ancient history, a bedtime story their grandparents told to distract them from the fact that dinner was just bread and onions, if they were lucky. Culturally, Spain still produced flashes of brilliance. The arts continued to glow dimly, with painters like Murillo and dramatists keeping up the illusion of vibrancy. But even here the cracks showed. The great creative energy of Spain was increasingly hampered by censorship, economic weakness, and the sheer gloom of national decline. It's hard to paint masterpieces when the state treasury can't afford the paint. Through all of this, Charles remained king in title but not in action. He was a figurehead, a tragic monarch carried along by forces he couldn't control and courtiers who used him like a royal puppet. Spain, in essence, was on autopilot, its destiny dictated by inertia and foreign interference rather than vision or leadership. The country staggered forward, not because of the king's guidance, but despite it. By the time Charles was in his 30s, Spain was no longer a dominant power, but a decaying relic of past glory. And everyone knew it. Foreign diplomats sniffed around Madrid like vultures around a dying animal, waiting for the inevitable collapse. The king's personal weakness mirrored the empire's decline, frail, stumbling, unable to sustain itself. Spain under Charles II wasn't just poorly ruled, it was barely ruled at all. The kingdom floated, rudderless through decades of crises, held together by habit, prayer, and the occasional miracle. But empires don't survive on autopilot forever. Eventually the bill comes due, and when the plane finally crashes, it takes more than Spain down with it. But that's a story for later. It's one thing to be a frail monarch with failing health and no heirs. It's another thing entirely to believe that the reason behind all your misfortunes is that someone somewhere has hexed you. Charles II of Spain wasn't just a sick king, he was a haunted one. And when your royal advisor list includes both generals and ghostbusters, something's gone wrong. Charles genuinely believed he was cursed. And to be fair, if anyone had a life tailor-made to inspire paranoia, it was him. He was born weak, grew up sickly, married twice without children, and ruled over an empire that was collapsing like a poorly baked flan. To Charles, these weren't just signs of bad luck or bad genetics. They were proof that dark forces were at work. The Spanish court of the 17th century wasn't exactly a hotbed of rational science. While other parts of Europe were tentatively poking at things like physics and astronomy, Madrid was still knee-deep in incense smoke, relics, and whispers of sorcery. Superstition wasn't fringe, it was mainstream. So when the king himself leaned into the idea that he was bewitched, nobody laughed. Instead, they nodded gravely, grabbed their crucifixes, and called in the nearest exorcist. Charles's paranoia grew so deep that he sincerely believed witches had robbed him of his health, his strength, and his ability to produce children. He once complained that his illnesses came and went as if by enchantment, which to him was not a metaphor. He suspected actual enchantment. Imagine your king telling you the national crisis isn't due to economic decline or military weakness, but because someone left a cursed toad in his soup. The rituals carried out to protect him read less like statecraft and more like rejected storylines from Scooby-Doo. Monks were summoned to chant over him. Relics were pressed to his body. Holy water was sprinkled with such regularity that Charles might as well have been marinating for sainthood. He was subjected to exorcisms, not once, not twice, but multiple times, the logic being that if one round of chanting and demon banishing didn't work, maybe the fourth would do the trick. One particularly bizarre ritual involved digging up the body of Charles's own mother, Mariana of Austria. Why? Because someone suggested she might have been involved in the curse. Yes, you read that right. In their quest to solve the king's supernatural woes, his advisors decided grave-robbing mum was the way forward. Unsurprisingly, this did not fix Charles's health. It did, however, cement the impression that the Spanish monarchy was running less on governance and more on ghost stories. This obsession with the supernatural didn't just affect Charles personally, it influenced politics. Ministers and courtiers weaponized the king's paranoia for their own gain. Whisper to Charles that a rival noble was in league with witches, and suddenly that noble's influence waned. Suggest that an opponent carried the evil eye and watched doors slam in their face. Court intrigue in Madrid had always been cutthroat, but under Charles it became equal parts dagger and Ouija board. Charles himself leaned into these fears with childlike sincerity. He wore amulets, clutched rosaries, and surrounded himself with priests whose job was less about guiding policy and more about keeping demons at bay. The king's daily life was littered with rituals designed to repel unseen enemies. It's one thing for a monarch to pray for guidance, it's another to treat every cough as potential proof of sorcery. This paranoia, of course, only made him seem weaker to foreign powers. Ambassadors sent back reports to Paris, London, and Vienna, not just about Spain's dwindling armies or empty treasuries, but about the king's fixation on curses and hexes. For a Europe already circling Spain like vultures, it was confirmation the empire wasn't just politically fragile, it was spiritually unhinged. And yet there's something deeply human in Charles's haunting fear. He wasn't a scheming tyrant or a ruthless conqueror. He was, in many ways, a frightened man trying to make sense of a life stacked with suffering. In a world where science had not yet replaced superstition, blaming witches for his misery probably felt more comforting than blaming fate or faulty genetics. A curse could, at least in theory, be broken. A defective dynasty could not. Still, it's hard not to smile at the absurdity. Spain was an empire spanning continents, its future hanging in the balance, and the man at its head was anxiously wondering if someone had hexed his bedroom slippers. At one point, Charles reportedly believed he had been bewitched with a spell made of human bones, brains, and entrails placed inside a cup of chocolate. Now that's one way to ruin hot cocoa forever. By the time of his final years, Charles's obsession with curses defined how he saw the world. His body betrayed him daily, his marriages had failed, his empire crumbled, so he turned to the supernatural as an explanation. It was easier to believe in witches than in the slow grind of history. But curses, real or imagined, could not save Spain. They only distracted a haunted king while his empire slipped away. In the end, Charles II wasn't just remembered as the bewitched because of his appearance or health. He believed it himself. He lived and ruled as if invisible forces were pulling the strings. And in a way, maybe they were, just not the witches he feared, but the far less mystical curses of genetics, economics, and history. If Charles II's personal life was a tragedy, his political legacy was a feeding frenzy. While the poor man struggled with health, superstition, and failed marriages, Europe wasn't shedding tears, it was sharpening knives. Every major power knew the Spanish king had no heir, and that meant the crown of Spain, along with its vast colonial empire, was about to go up for grabs. Charles wasn't just a king, he was Europe's hottest real estate listing. To understand the scale of the prize, let's take inventory. Spain in the late 17th century may have been a declining power, but its empire was still enormous. Vast stretches of the Americas, rich with silver mines and trade routes, belonged to Madrid. So did chunks of Italy, the Spanish Netherlands, modern-day Belgium and Luxembourg, and territories scattered across the globe. Controlling Spain meant controlling a global empire, the kind of prize no ambitious monarch could ignore. Enter France, Austria, and just about everyone else with a crown and a sword. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, who already believed the world orbited around his magnificence, had a grandson, Philip of Anjou, whom he thought would look fantastic in a Spanish crown. After all, Charles's mother was a Habsburg, but also closely tied to the French royal family. Louis argued that his family had a perfectly legitimate claim. Of course, his version of legitimate conveniently aligned with France's hunger for power and dominance in Europe. Across the Holy Roman Empire, the Austrian Habsburgs felt very differently. To them, Spain's throne was not a prize up for sale, but a sacred family heirloom. They were Habsburgs too. In fact, they had been the other half of the sprawling Habsburg dynasty before Spain and Austria had split their branches. The Austrians saw Charles's death as their chance to reunite the dynasty under Vienna's control. Their candidate, Archduke Charles, who was young, healthy, and not cursed with a jawline that could double as a siege weapon. So on one side, France was salivating, on the other, Austria was practically frothing. And then there were the other powers, England and the Dutch Republic, who didn't want either France or Austria to get too powerful. If Spain fell to France, Louis XIV would control a super empire stretching from the Americas to Italy. If Austria took it, the Habsburg grip on Europe would tighten dangerously. To England and the Dutch, both outcomes looked like a recipe for continental domination. And for them, domination was fine as long as it wasn't someone else's. The result? Years of scheming, negotiations, and treaties, all centered on one sickly man who spent most of his time clutching rosaries and sipping medicinal chocolate. Charles's marriages, which were supposed to solve this problem by producing heirs, instead became little more than diplomatic stunts. Marie-Louise of Orléans had tied Spain to France. Maria Anna of Neuburg had tied it to the German states. Neither had produced a child, but both had kept the rumor mills and foreign diplomats busy. Foreign ambassadors swarmed Madrid like bees around honey. Each one hoped to sway Charles, his advisors, or even his doctors to favor their candidate for succession. It wasn't just politics, it was espionage, bribery, and psychological warfare. Imagine the Spanish court as a never-ending reality show, where the contestants were foreign monarchies, and the final rose was the entire Spanish Empire. The treaties drafted during this period read like the fine print of a particularly messy divorce settlement. At one point, France and Austria tried to agree on splitting Spain's territories between them, as though carving up an empire was no more complicated than dividing a cake. England and the Dutch got involved too, proposing their own partition plans that basically boiled down to, "We'll let you have some of Spain, but not enough to crush us." But the great irony of it all was that Charles himself was not just ignored, but actively sidelined in these discussions. He was the King of Spain, but he was treated like the house in a will, something to be divided, not someone to be consulted. His ill health and lack of authority made him less of a monarch and more of a chess piece. Everyone maneuvered around him while he prayed, panicked, and occasionally signed papers he didn't fully understand. The pressure on Charles grew unbearable in his final years. Whichever candidate he named in his will would determine the balance of power in Europe. On his deathbed, torn between French and Austrian claims, Charles supposedly prayed for guidance. Perhaps unsurprisingly, he also worried that whichever choice he made might unleash curses, wars, or supernatural consequences. What he didn't realize was that the real curse was geopolitics. When he finally named Philip of Anjou, the French candidate, as his heir, it sent shockwaves across Europe. To Louis XIV, it was a triumph. To Austria, a betrayal. To England and the Dutch, a direct threat. Charles hadn't just picked a successor, he had lit the fuse for the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict so sprawling and destructive it would consume Europe for over a decade. In the end, Charles's empty cradle became the most expensive inheritance dispute in history. His failure to produce an heir didn't just doom his dynasty, it destabilized Europe for a generation. The Spanish throne was less a crown and more a Pandora's box, and when it opened, the consequences were catastrophic. Charles II, the bewitched, may have been frail, sickly, and haunted, but to Europe's kings and queens he was irresistible, because behind his failing body stood an empire still rich enough, vast enough, and tempting enough to fight over. Spain wasn't just a kingdom, it was the jackpot, and Charles, poor Charles, was the cursed lottery ticket everyone wanted to cash. By the late 1690s, King Charles II of Spain was not so much ruling as he was surviving. Barely. His health, already fragile since birth, began to collapse with the slow-motion drama of a very long car crash. Imagine watching a candle sputter in the wind for decades and then finally, in its last months, not just sputtering but collapsing into a puddle of wax that everyone has been expecting since 1661. That was Charles in his final years, alive but mostly in the way a crumbling ruin is still technically a building. Contemporaries remarked on how his body seemed to be giving up piece by piece. He suffered convulsions, headaches, fevers, and constant intestinal problems. Food was a challenge. Chewing was nearly impossible with his deformed jaw. Digestion was worse, and nutrition was basically a foreign concept. Spain's most powerful man was nourished by broths, spoon-fed like a toddler, though with the digestive efficiency of a clogged sewer. His condition gave his enemies plenty of fuel for whispers. Was he cursed, bewitched, or simply doomed by his family's relentless inbreeding? Whichever it was, Charles became the poster child for don't let your family tree look like a wreath. But his health woes weren't merely private misfortunes, they were public events. Every sneeze, every fainting spell, every rumor about his digestion rippled through the court like breaking news. Ministers, courtiers, and foreign ambassadors all kept obsessive watch over the king's decline. After all, his death meant more than personal tragedy. It meant the end of a dynasty and the redistribution of one of Europe's largest empires. Imagine if the fate of the world's balance of power hinged on whether one man's intestines could keep functioning. That's how Europe felt every time Charles coughed. The doctors, bless their 17th century confidence, were not exactly helpful. They bled him, they purged him, they prescribed concoctions that were more likely to poison than heal. At one point his condition was treated with bezoar stones, those mysterious anti-poison lumps found in animal stomachs, because clearly if your king is dying, why not feed him rocks? The medical approach was less science and more kitchen experiment gone wrong. The humor angle here practically writes itself. Charles's medical chart was essentially an early draft of a horror novel, complete with bleeding, leeches, and suspicious powders. As his condition worsened, his mental state deteriorated too. He became increasingly paranoid, convinced that spells and dark forces were at work. Priests were summoned to perform exorcisms on the king himself, because when the doctors can't fix you, why not try ghost-busting? These rituals terrified Charles, but also convinced him he was genuinely under attack from the supernatural. It's hard enough to face your mortality, but Charles faced it believing demons had set up permanent residence in his colon. And then came the infamous autopsy. After his death in 1700, Spanish officials opened him up, hoping to provide some final explanation for decades of royal misery. What they found was equal parts grotesque and legendary. A body without blood, a heart the size of a peppercorn, intestines rotten and gangrenous, a single testicle black as coal, a head full of water. If the report reads like a medieval shopping list for a witch's stew, that's because it practically was. It painted a picture, not of a king, but of a collection of medical disasters stitched together by royal titles. The diagnosis: Charles had been dying since birth and somehow stretched it into a 40-year career, or, as one historian put it more kindly, a miracle he lived at all. Of course, Spain didn't have the luxury of morbid curiosity. The king's decline sparked near hysteria in Madrid. Without heirs, the Habsburg line in Spain would end with him. Ministers argued, foreign powers schemed, and the Spanish people watched their monarch fade while praying for a miracle heir that would never arrive. The king himself, despite his pain, was fixated on this too. His marriages had been barren, his attempts at continuity fruitless, and now his final legacy was ensuring that Europe's great powers would tear Spain apart like wolves fighting over a carcass. Charles's last days were marked by a mix of ritual, resignation, and the constant hum of court intrigue. He prayed, he wept, and he endured yet more bizarre treatments, everything from holy relics laid on his chest to the drinking of strange potions. He seemed more patient than ruler, more victim than king. His decline was slow, public, and theatrical, Europe's most depressing long-running show. Finally, on November 1, 1700, at the age of 38, Charles II died. For Spain it was the end of an era, and the beginning of a geopolitical free-for-all. For Charles, It was the merciful close of a life spent in constant suffering. His death was less a shock than a grimly expected curtain call. Or, as one wag at the time might have put it, basically he died 3 times before breakfast. Charles II of Spain died in 1700, and Europe collectively said, finally. The poor man had been expected to die for most of his life, so when it actually happened it wasn't so much shocking news as it was a very delayed RSVP. But his death wasn't just the end of a king, it was the starter pistol for one of the biggest conflicts of the 18th century, the War of the Spanish Succession. If Charles couldn't chew, Europe certainly bit off more than it could handle. The problem was simple to explain and nearly impossible to solve. Charles left no heir. No heir meant no clear successor, and no clear successor meant that Spain, the empire of gold and silver, of vast colonies, and of strategic territories, was suddenly the most valuable piece of political real estate on the continent. Imagine a mansion with crumbling walls but still sitting on prime beachfront property. Everyone wanted a piece. Charles, in his last will, had actually chosen a successor, Philip of Anjou, the teenage grandson of Louis XIV of France. That meant a Bourbon would sit on Spain's throne. For France, this was a jackpot. Imagine your family suddenly inheriting a whole second empire, like winning the world's most aggressive monopoly game. For everyone else in Europe it was a nightmare. The thought of France and Spain united under one family made other nations panic. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and just about anyone not wearing a fleur-de-lis feared that Louis XIV was about to turn Europe into his personal Versailles-themed theme park. So naturally they went to war, and not a small neighbourly war either. This was one of those all-in, everyone picking sides kind of conflicts that stretched from 1701 to 17. The War of the Spanish Succession engulfed Europe, dragging in powers from Portugal to Savoy, and even spilling across the Atlantic into colonial skirmishes. Basically, if you were a soldier in the early 1700s and didn't know who you were supposed to be fighting, don't worry, you'd probably find out by lunchtime. The war had some of the century's most dramatic moments. Legendary generals like the Duke of Marlborough won fame at battles such as Blenheim, Ramillies and Oudenarde. Austria threw its weight behind its own candidate for the throne, Archduke Charles, who eventually became Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI. The fighting raged for more than a decade, a costly tug-of-war with thousands of lives lost and fortunes drained, all because one sickly king couldn't produce a single heir. Spain itself, meanwhile, was in no position to handle the chaos. Its economy was battered, its armies under strength, and its colonies vulnerable. While foreign troops clashed over who would wear the Spanish crown, actual Spaniards endured famine, taxation, and war fatigue. It was like watching 2 rich neighbors fight over who gets to own your collapsing house while you're stuck living in the basement. Finally, after more than a decade of bloodshed, treaties were signed, the most famous being the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. The settlement reshaped Europe's map. Philip of Anjou was confirmed as Philip V of Spain, the first Bourbon king, but with one critical catch. He and his descendants were barred from ever inheriting the French throne. No supermonarchy allowed. France got to keep its pride. Austria picked up juicy territories in Italy and the Low Countries. Britain snagged Gibraltar, and still has it today, much to Spain's irritation. And the Dutch, well, they mostly got exhaustion. For Spain, the outcome was bittersweet. It kept its empire, but it was now firmly under Bourbon rule. The once mighty Habsburg dynasty of Spain was gone, extinguished with Charles II. The country never quite recovered its old glory. The 16th century golden age of conquistadors and treasure fleets was long past. By the 18th century, Spain was more like the faded former champion that everyone respected but no one feared. Charles's personal tragedy became Spain's geopolitical decline, and that brings us to Charles's legacy. On paper, he was king of one of the world's greatest empires. In reality, he was a man trapped in a body and dynasty that betrayed him. His reign was marked by regents, court intrigue, superstition and decline. Spain needed a ruler, It got a living symbol of what happens when dynastic obsession with pure bloodlines goes horribly wrong. The Habsburgs had spent generations tightening the family tree into something closer to a family wreath, and Charles was the unfortunate proof that genetics, like politics, can collapse under too much short-term strategy. Yet for all his flaws, Charles inspires not scorn but a strange sympathy. He didn't choose his fate. He didn't design his jaw, his illnesses, or his empty cradle. He wanted heirs but never had them, wanted strength but never found it, and wanted peace but left behind war. His life was tragic, yes, but also a warning. Power built on fragile foundations, whether genetic or political, eventually crumbles. Spain would go on under the Bourbons, adapting to new realities, but Charles II remained etched in memory as El Hechizado, the bewitched, the king who couldn't chew his food, couldn't father children, and couldn't save his empire, yet still managed to change the face of Europe by dying, or as history might joke, Charles couldn't chew, but Europe certainly bit off more than it could handle. Before there were Instagram filters, before awkward selfies, and long before anyone said "say cheese," humanity had a much simpler relationship with light. We noticed that it behaved in weird, sneaky ways. If you've ever sat in a dark room with a tiny crack in the curtain and seen the outside world projected upside down on the opposite wall, congratulations, you've just experienced the magic trick that kick-started photography. This trick has a name, the camera obscura, which literally means dark chamber. Sounds dramatic, but hey, everything sounds cooler in Latin. The origins of this idea stretch far back. Ancient China was already onto it. Around the 5th century BCE, philosopher Mosey described how light traveling in straight lines through a pinhole created an inverted image on a surface inside a dark box. In other words, while the rest of the world was trying not to get invaded, Mosey was inventing the first visual science experiment. His conclusion: light is predictable, images can be captured, and shadows are sneakier than they look. Meanwhile, over in ancient Greece, our old friend Aristotle got curious too. He noticed that if you poked holes in leaves or wicker baskets, the round shape of the sun would project itself on the ground. Did he immediately realize he'd stumbled upon the foundation of cameras, cinema, and cat videos? No, but he did recognize that this was more than just a party trick. Unfortunately, Aristotle's conclusions, like many things in Greek philosophy, were preserved in dusty text rather than in working gadgets. The world wasn't quite ready for the real housewives of Athens in live projection. Fast forward to the Islamic Golden Age, around the 10th century, and along comes Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as al-Hazin. This guy wasn't just dabbling in light, he was full-on obsessed with it. He wrote an entire book of optics, which basically made him the Bill Nye of his day, but with more turbans and fewer bow ties. Ibn al-Haytham didn't just describe how the camera obscura worked, he used it to prove that vision happens when light enters the eye, not when the eye shoots beams out into the world. Yes, ancient people really thought our eyeballs were tiny flashlights. So not only did he advance optics, but he also ruined the superhero fantasies of anyone hoping to shoot lasers out of their face. By the time we stumble into the Renaissance, the camera obscura was no longer just a scientific curiosity. It became the secret weapon of artists. Imagine you're a painter in the 1500s. You want to impress your rich patron by painting a portrait that doesn't make him look like a melted candle. Problem: human faces are complicated, and perspective is hard. Enter the camera obscura. All you had to do was sit in a darkened room, let the outside scene project through a hole, and trace the lines. Congratulations, you're now a Renaissance master, with only half the struggle and twice the smugness. One of the most famous dabblers was Leonardo da Vinci. Of course he was. Leonardo dabbled in everything. War machines? Sure. Flying contraptions? Why not? Painting the Mona Lisa with a smile so mysterious people still argue about it 500 years later? Easy. Naturally, he also sketched out detailed diagrams of the camera obscura. To him, it was not just a neat gadget, but also a way to understand how the human eye worked. And if there was one thing Leonardo loved, it was turning everyday objects into metaphors for cosmic truths. For him, a dark box with a hole wasn't just optics. It was a philosophical reflection on vision itself, as you do. But here's the catch. While the camera obscura could project images, it couldn't capture them. It was like a magical Snapchat filter that disappeared the moment you blinked. The Renaissance artists who used it could trace what they saw, but the image itself was fleeting, temporary. That's why it became a tool for painters rather than a standalone invention. It was basically a glorified drawing assistant, a medieval Photoshop that only worked if you had steady hands and a lot of patience. Now, let's pause and appreciate the hilarity here. For thousands of years, humans knew how to project upside-down images in a box, but nobody thought to make it permanent. Entire civilizations said, "Cool trick, let's move on," while peasants continued to pay fortunes for portraits that made them look like haunted potatoes. Seriously, if you compare a medieval noble's painting to the real thing, it's clear the artist was guessing half the time. The camera obscura could have saved centuries of bad chin proportions. Yet despite its limitations, the camera obscura had one superpower. It made people realize that light itself could be manipulated. It turned vision into something scientific, not just mystical. No more theories about I-beams or gods painting the world around us. The truth was simpler and stranger. Light could bend, bounce, and be captured, if only someone figured out how. So, the camera obscura wasn't the first camera in the modern sense, but it was the awkward ancestor that paved the way. Think of it as the flip phone of photography. Clunky, limited, but revolutionary in its own time. Without it, we wouldn't have daguerreotypes, Kodak film, Polaroids, or that blurry picture of your dog you'll never delete. In short, the camera obscura was a dark box with bright ideas. It began in ancient philosophy, blossomed in the Islamic Golden Age, and flourished in Renaissance studios. It couldn't freeze time, but it gave humanity a tantalizing glimpse of what might be possible. And one day somebody would finally ask the million-dollar question. What if the picture didn't vanish? Until then, the world would keep drawing, tracing and guessing. And ordinary people? Well, they were still stuck paying for portraits where their noses looked like mountains and their eyes wandered off in different directions. By the 1700s, humanity was tired of playing peekaboo with light. The camera obscura was fascinating, sure, but it was also a massive tease. The image appeared, beautiful and crisp, and then it vanished, faster than your motivation to go to the gym in February. For centuries, people had been staring at these projections thinking, if only there was a way to freeze this. The dream was simple: trap light, pin it down, and make it permanent. The reality? A messy parade of chemical spills, burned papers, and more than a few disappointed scientists coughing in darkened laboratories. The quest to capture light led experimenters straight into the dangerous arms of chemistry. Early pioneers discovered that certain substances reacted dramatically when exposed to sunlight. Chief among these was silver nitrate, a seemingly unremarkable salt that had the quirky habit of darkening when hit by light. Doctors had already noticed this property when they used it for medicinal purposes, because nothing says "trust me, I'm a doctor" like staining your patient's skin purple. But for the budding proto-photographers of the 18th century, silver nitrate was more than a medical oddity. It was a potential key to trapping shadows forever. Enter Thomas Wedgwood, son of the famous potter Josiah Wedgwood. Unlike his father, who was busy revolutionizing dinnerware, Thomas wanted to revolutionize how we see the world. In the 1790s, he began experimenting with placing objects on paper coated with silver nitrate, creating what we now call photograms, basically silhouettes of leaves, cutouts, and other flat objects. The results were magical, until they weren't, because as soon as you exposed the images to light in order to actually look at them, they kept darkening until they disappeared. Imagine working tirelessly to capture an image, only to have it self-destruct the moment you admire it. It was like inventing Snapchat 200 years too early, except instead of disappearing in 10 seconds, it vanished over the course of a long, bitter sigh. Wedgwood's notes reveal both excitement and despair. He could create temporary impressions, but he couldn't stop the relentless march of light that turned his images into smudges. Without a method to fix the pictures, his efforts were doomed. Still, his experiments were important stepping stones. He was essentially the guy who stumbled on the recipe but forgot to write down the final ingredient. Another curious tinkerer was Humphrey Davy, a chemist who later gained fame for discovering several elements. Davy joined forces with Wedgwood and tried to improve the method. Together they produced what may have been the first scientific paper about making images with light, published in 1802. The conclusion: silver nitrate could capture silhouettes, but until someone invented a way to keep them from fading, the dream of permanent photography was as distant as a clear day in London. Meanwhile, others across Europe were burning the midnight oil, and sometimes the paper itself, trying to improve on the process. Many experiments ended in failure, but failure is a generous word. Accidentally set things on fire might be more accurate. As one wit later put it, scientists were burning holes in paper trying to make pictures, accidentally inventing both photography and the smell of disappointment. But the dream was irresistible. The Enlightenment and early industrial era was a time obsessed with progress, cataloguing, and knowledge. Naturalists wanted to capture the delicate structure of plants. Scientists longed for precise diagrams without the bias of the human hand. And the public? Well, they were still stuck with expensive portrait painters who insisted on making them look noble instead of accurate. The hunger for mechanical truth was building, and photography promised to deliver it. The real challenge was that every experiment had two steps: capture the image and then keep it. Silver nitrate was great at the first but terrible at the second. Some scientists toyed with other light-sensitive compounds like silver chloride and discovered similar frustrations. The image always faded. It was like trying to bottle a rainbow, beautiful for a second then gone. Despite all the false starts, progress inched forward. Each failure taught the next generation a little more, and though Wedgwood never solved the permanence problem, his experiments planted the idea in scientific minds. Light could not only create images, it could write them. All it needed was the right chemistry. By the early 1800s, the race was heating up. Across Europe, gentlemen scientists with too much free time and too many chemicals were competing to be the first to tame light. This wasn't just about science anymore. It was about prestige, immortality, and bragging rights. Imagine a bunch of powdered wig inventors trying to outdo each other in their basements, all while inhaling enough toxic fumes to qualify as a workplace hazard. The stakes were high, but so were the arsenic levels. The obsession to trap shadows was no passing fad. It was part of a larger cultural hunger for permanence in a rapidly changing world. The Industrial Revolution was transforming how people lived, worked, and communicated. Suddenly, machines could spin cotton faster than human hands, trains could move goods faster than horses, and factories could pump out products faster than artisans. Why shouldn't machines also capture images faster than an artist with a brush? This period of experimentation was, in many ways, the adolescence of photography, awkward, messy, and full of unrealized potential. The results weren't yet what we'd call photographs, but they carried the DNA of the future. Without these early chemical dabblers, the breakthroughs of the 1830s and 1840s would never have been possible. So, while Wedgwood and his peers never got the glory, they deserve a place in the Hall of Almosts. They were the ones chasing shadows, failing spectacularly, and leaving behind smudges that whispered, "It can be done." The world just had to wait for someone stubborn enough, or reckless enough, to make the image stay put. By the late 1830s, the scientific world had plenty of almosts when it came to capturing images. For centuries, people had been teasing light into boxes and staining paper with chemicals, only to watch their pictures fade away like promises to start jogging. But then along came a man with enough theatrical flair to make science look like stage magic: Louis-Jacques Daguerre. Daguerre wasn't just a tinkering chemist, he was an artist and showman. Before dabbling with photography, he made his career as a painter and stage designer. In fact, he was famous for his diorama theatre, where massive painted scenes combined with clever lighting created breathtaking illusions. Audiences gasped as entire landscapes seemed to shift from day to night. He wasn't just creating art, he was creating wonder. And wonder, as it turned out, was the perfect fuel for inventing photography. Daguerre partnered with another inventor, Nicephore Niepce, who had already managed to make the world's first surviving photograph in the 1820s. Niepce's method involved bitumen of Judea. Yes, the same tar-like substance used in ancient construction, which hardened in light. It worked, but the process was painfully slow, requiring hours of exposure to get a ghostly, blurry picture. Imagine sitting for a family portrait so long you could knit a sweater before it was finished. That's not a photo, that's a hostage situation. After Niepce's death in 1833, Daguerre pushed forward alone, determined to find a faster, sharper, more practical method. His solution came in 1839, when he unveiled the daguerreotype to the world, and suddenly, society was left with its jaw on the floor. So what exactly was this silver sorcery? The daguerreotype involved polishing a copper plate coated with a thin layer of silver until it gleamed like a mirror. The plate was then sensitized with iodine vapors, making it light-sensitive. After exposure in the camera for several minutes, the plate was developed using mercury fumes. Yes, you heard that right, mercury. Nothing says art like sticking your head over a bowl of toxic vapor to see if your invention worked. The final step was fixing the image with salt, which locked the picture in place. The results? Absolutely stunning. The daguerreotype produced incredibly sharp, detailed images. So sharp you could count the wrinkles on someone's forehead or the stray hairs in their mustache. Compared to the blurry experiments of earlier years, this was crystal clear reality staring back at you. It was as if someone had taken truth, dipped it in silver, and served it up for the world to examine. Of course, there was a catch. The exposure time required was still long, typically between 5 and 15 minutes in bright light. That meant subjects had to sit stock still, without blinking, twitching, or sneezing. As one observer quipped, the first portraits required sitting still for so long, you basically had to become a piece of furniture. Unsurprisingly, most people in early daguerreotypes looked serious, stiff, and slightly haunted. It wasn't that Victorians didn't smile. It's just that smiling for 10 minutes straight was a dental endurance test no one could pass. The sharpness of the images also delivered an unexpected cultural shock. For the first time, ordinary people saw themselves with uncompromising accuracy. There were no flattering brushstrokes, no painterly airbrushing, no artistic liberties to make you look slimmer, taller, or more noble. The daguerreotype was merciless. It revealed every wrinkle, pimple, and awkward feature you'd been politely ignoring. Some people were delighted, others were horrified. Imagine thinking you looked like a Greek statue, only to discover you looked more like a Greek salad. Despite the challenges, daguerreotypes became a sensation. In 1839, when Daguerre revealed his invention in Paris, the French government quickly recognized its significance. They purchased the rights and declared it a gift free to the world. For once, France was in a generous mood. The daguerreotype process spread rapidly across Europe and America, launching a photographic craze. Studios popped up in major cities, offering portraits to the growing middle class who could finally afford something more accurate and cheaper than painted canvases. The craze also produced some quirky side effects. Because the daguerreotype was a direct positive process, meaning there was no negative, it produced a single unique image. If you wanted copies, tough luck. You had to drag yourself back into the studio and sit through another mercury-flavored marathon. Each plate was a one-of-a-kind relic, like a personal silver relic of your existence. This uniqueness made daguerreotypes precious family treasures, often passed down like sacred heirlooms. Critics and skeptics, of course, had their doubts. Some claimed the technology was unnatural or dangerous, fretting about sun stealing. Others simply complained that it was too sharp. One reviewer even joked that daguerreotypes were too honest for vanity. When people saw their first photographic likeness, the shock was real. Society was not quite ready for unvarnished reality. Yet Daguerre's invention marked a cultural revolution. For the first time in history, Anyone could preserve their appearance with stunning accuracy. Memory itself had gained a new tool. Images no longer lived only in the mind or in the shaky hand of an artist. They could now live in silver, wars, fashion, cityscapes, even scientific observations. Everything would soon be captured through this new shimmering window onto reality. Daguerre himself became something of a celebrity, though he didn't live long enough to see just how world-changing his invention would become. He died in 1851, but by then photography had already spread like wildfire, inspiring countless improvements and rival methods. Still, the daguerreotype was the spark, the moment when chasing shadows turned into capturing faces. So when you see those haunting black and white portraits from the 1840s, remember, those people weren't naturally that stiff, they just hadn't blinked in 10 minutes. And behind the serious stares and solemn poses, there's also a hint of shock. The world had finally found a way to trap light, and humanity was staring into its own reflection, with awe, horror, and maybe a little neck pain. When you think of the word selfie, you probably picture someone tilting their phone at an odd angle, half their forehead cropped out, and at least one duck face in the frame. But the truth is, selfies have been around far longer than Instagram. In fact, the very first photographic self-portrait was taken in 1839, and its creator wasn't an influencer. It was a Philadelphia metalworker named Robert Cornelius. Cornelius wasn't exactly your average guy. He came from a family of lamp manufacturers, which already gave him an edge in the light department. Fascinated by chemistry and optics, he started tinkering with photography just as the daguerreotype craze was beginning to spread from France. But unlike most people who had their likeness captured by professional studios, Cornelius decided to turn the camera on himself. And thus, without hashtags or filters, the world's very first selfie was born. Now let's be clear, this was not the kind of quick snap you can take today in a bathroom mirror. Cornelius had to set up his camera, prepare a silver-coated plate, sensitize it with iodine fumes, and then expose it for several minutes. Only then could an image form. Taking a selfie in 1839 was not a matter of vanity. It was a matter of endurance. The surviving photo of Cornelius shows a young man leaning slightly forward, hair tousled, eyes staring intently at the camera. He looks both confident and exhausted, which makes sense considering he had to remain as still as a statue while the plate soaked up enough light to record his face. As one witty commentator put it, it took several minutes, basically a plank of wood with more charisma. And yet, there's something charmingly human about Cornelius's experiment. He's not dressed in formal attire, as most early portrait sitters were. He doesn't look like he's auditioning to be a Renaissance noble. He looks, well, casual, maybe even a little mischievous, like he knows he's doing something new. In a world where portraiture had always been stiff, expensive, and reserved for the elite, Cornelius's selfie feels fresh. It's the 1839 equivalent of someone breaking the rules by posting a goofy grin online. Of course, Cornelius wasn't setting out to invent the selfie culture. His experiment was part science, part curiosity, and part proof that the daguerreotype process could be used outside professional studios. But what he stumbled upon was far larger, the idea that ordinary people could turn the camera toward themselves. For centuries, self-portraits were the domain of artists like Rembrandt or Van Gogh, who painted themselves partly to study technique and partly because models are expensive. Cornelius brought that tradition into the modern age with silver, mercury fumes, and a lot more waiting around. The humor of it all is that his picture looks uncannily modern. Sure, it's grainy and black and white, but the pose, the direct stare, the slight lean could easily fit into your cousin's social media feed. The only thing missing? Duck lips. He invented the selfie, but sadly, duck lips were still a century away. Humanity had taken its first step toward the endless parade of bathroom mirror shots that now flood our phones. Cornelius didn't just stop at one experiment, though. He actually opened one of the first photographic studios in America, where he and his partners captured portraits for paying customers. The timing was perfect. Middle-class families who could never afford painted portraits suddenly found photography within reach. It was still expensive and slow. but compared to hiring an oil painter to spend weeks immortalizing your awkward jawline, a daguerreotype was a bargain. Word spread quickly, and by the 1840s, portrait studios were springing up in cities and towns across America and Europe. People lined up to have their faces etched onto silver plates. For many, it was the first time they had ever seen a true likeness of themselves. The process was still sluggish. You had to hold still for minutes at a time, but the results were astonishing. No more guessing whether the artist captured your good side. The camera showed all the sides, good or bad. These early portraits weren't just vanity projects. They became treasured keepsakes, family heirlooms, and mementos of loved ones. In a world without digital storage, photography offered something priceless: permanence. For the first time, ordinary people could pass down their actual appearance to future generations. Selfies weren't just casual fun, they were historical records. Cornelius himself eventually returned to his family's lamp business and didn't spend the rest of his life chasing fame as the father of selfies. But his legacy lived on in that single image. His curious experiment captured a cultural shift. Photography was no longer just a scientific marvel or a studio novelty. It was personal. It belonged to everyone, not just aristocrats or artists. Looking back, Cornelius's selfie is both funny and profound. Funny, because he looks like a young man trying to impress someone who hasn't walked into the room yet. Profound, because he unknowingly laid the foundation for a future where billions of people would regularly point cameras at themselves. From one blurry silver plate in 1839 to billions of smartphone selfies today, the leap is staggering, but the impulse is the same. Humans want to see themselves, to capture a moment, and maybe to share it with others. So the next time you roll your eyes at someone posting yet another bathroom mirror shot, just remember, Robert Cornelius did it first. He had no filters, no likes, and no delete button, just several minutes of standing still hoping his experiment would work, and it did. In that sense, every selfie ever taken is a little tribute to the man who leaned into his camera, stared it down, and accidentally made history. When photography burst onto the scene in the 19th century, it didn't politely knock on the door of society. It barged in, set its tripod down in the parlor and declared, "I can freeze time." Understandably, people didn't know how to react. Some were thrilled, others terrified, and a few decided the camera was basically a devil's eye mounted in a box. After all, humanity had gone from portraits painted with flattering artistic interpretation to a strange contraption that revealed every wrinkle, crooked tooth, and unfortunate haircut with merciless honesty. One of the most famous reactions came from the belief that photographs could capture not just appearances, but the very soul. For centuries, many cultures already had a deep connection between images and essence. Ancient taboos warned against being depicted in drawings or carvings, fearing that likenesses created spiritual vulnerability. So when photography emerged, it wasn't hard for some to leap to the conclusion that sitting for a photo was basically offering your soul up to Kodak's darker cousin. To be fair, the experience itself didn't help. Imagine standing stiffly for several minutes while a stranger fiddled with mysterious chemicals and aimed a wooden box at your face. The box had glass, mirrors, and emitted strange smells. To a suspicious mind, this wasn't art. It was witchcraft with better optics. In some rural areas, families refused to be photographed, fearing misfortune or even death would follow. And honestly, considering the track record of 19th century technology which had a habit of exploding, leaking poison, or electrocuting people, that wasn't the most irrational worry. The idea of a camera stealing your soul sounds ridiculous today, until you realize how many hours modern people give away to social media filters. If photography didn't take our souls, social media certainly rented them out. On the flip side, the artistic elite had a different gripe. Photography was too brutally honest. Painters could add a hint of nobility to your posture, soften a jawline, or conveniently forget that your nose resembled a lopsided potato. A daguerreotype, however, delivered reality in all its unvarnished glory. Suddenly, society's powerful men and fashionable ladies couldn't hide behind the brushstrokes of flattery. The French poet Charles Baudelaire was famously unimpressed, grumbling that photography was little more than a mechanical trick that would destroy true art. He wasn't alone. Many critics feared that if anyone could own a cheap likeness of themselves, painting would lose its cultural importance. For the upper classes, the horror wasn't that photography was dark magic, it was that it democratized vanity. This was, after all, an age when appearances mattered deeply. A single unflattering portrait could undo years of careful grooming, social maneuvering and corset-wearing. Imagine a Victorian socialite seeing her first photographic portrait and realizing she didn't look like a queen of elegance but like someone caught mid-sneeze. That shock was real. While elites debated, ordinary folks were thrilled. For the first time in history, middle-class families could afford portraits. No more begging a cousin who could sort of paint to immortalize grandma's likeness. Now you could walk into a studio, hold still and walk out with proof that your family existed. Photographic studios sprouted across Europe and America, with advertisements promising the marvel of owning your own likeness, something once reserved for kings and bishops. Crowds lined up in cities to get their photos taken. Sometimes it was an entire family crammed together, sometimes just an individual trying their best to look dignified, while probably developing leg cramps from holding still for several minutes. People brought props, books to look scholarly, canes to look respectable, or pets to show they had a soft side. The photographs themselves may have looked stern, but beneath the surface society was buzzing with the excitement of self-representation. Of course, superstition lingered. In some communities, people avoided photography not because of vanity, but because of fear of spiritual exposure. In others, however, the very strangeness of photography made it useful for entirely new practices. By the mid-19th century, spirit photography became a fad. Photographers, often with trick exposures, produced ghostly images showing departed loved ones floating behind their grieving relatives. Was it comforting? Was it a scam? Absolutely both. Even governments and institutions began to use photography in ways that unsettled people. Police forces adopted photographs for criminal identification, leading to the first mugshots. If your face ended up in one of those, it wasn't just embarrassing, it was immortalized proof of your bad decisions. At its heart, the spread of photography in society was a mix of wonder and paranoia. For every grandmother convinced her spirit had been trapped, there was a young couple cherishing their first photographic keepsake. For every artist who sneered at the medium, there was a factory worker proudly displaying his likeness on the mantle. Photography didn't just capture faces, it captured reactions, fears and fantasies. It forced society to confront uncomfortable truths, that appearances were fragile, that vanity was universal, and that technology would keep barging in whether people were ready or not. Imagine explaining to a skeptical Victorian that the soul-stealing machine would eventually be carried in everyone's pocket, used to snap pictures of cats in silly hats, brunch plates, and teenagers perfecting the art of duck lips. The Victorians would be horrified. And then, inevitably, they'd probably line up for their turn too. By the mid-19th century, photography had marched out of the laboratory and into everyday life. What began as a scientific curiosity and artistic experiment quickly became a booming business, transforming not only how people preserved their memories, but also how they presented themselves to the world. Suddenly, what had once been a mysterious chemical trick reserved for tinkerers and scientists was now available on the high street, sandwiched between the tailor's shop and the apothecary. The arrival of portrait studios was like opening the gates of self-image democracy. No longer did you need to commission an artist for a portrait that might take weeks and cost a fortune. Instead, you could pop into a studio, sit uncomfortably still for a while, and walk out with a likeness you could treasure or regret for the rest of your life. Studios exploded in popularity across Europe and America. They were often set up with grand backdrops, painted curtains depicting exotic landscapes, marble columns, or pastoral meadows, so that you could look like a world traveler without ever leaving your town. Owners advertised heavily, promising lifelike portraits that would impress your relatives or reassure your descendants that yes, you were indeed as serious and stiff as you looked. Walking into a portrait studio was a bit like walking into a time machine that only worked one way. You froze yourself forever in a pose you might have regretted within 5 minutes. Photography quickly became a marker of status. Having a portrait meant you were respectable enough to sit still, dressed in your finest clothing, while someone captured your essence on a plate. Wealthier families commissioned elaborate portraits with props, pocket watches to signal punctuality, books to imply intelligence, or small dogs to suggest gentility. Even more telling was the fashion for cartes de visite, small photographic calling cards that could be exchanged with friends and family. Imagine a 19th century version of Instagram, but printed on stiff cardboard. People collected them in albums, traded them at social gatherings, and proudly displayed them like trophies. If you wanted to flex your social connections, you'd whip out your album and casually show off the photo of a distant cousin, or, if you were really impressive, a celebrity or political figure. But photography wasn't just for the living. Enter post-mortem photography, a practice that may sound unsettling today, but was deeply meaningful in the 19th century. Death was an ever-present reality, with high infant mortality rates and epidemics cutting through families. For many grieving parents, a photograph taken after death was the only image they would ever have of their child. Bodies were carefully posed to appear peaceful, sometimes even seated upright with family members gathered around. The result was meant to create the illusion of life lingering in death, a way of softening the finality of loss. To modernize, these photos can feel eerie, but to Victorians they were tangible proof of love and remembrance. Funny angle. Nothing says "I'll cherish you forever" quite like having your corpse dressed up in its Sunday best and photographed for the family album. Awkward? Absolutely. Comforting? In its own way, yes. Photography was no longer just art or science. It was a commodity. Studios charged fees based on size, quality, and presentation. A larger portrait in a fancy frame could be a small fortune, while simple cartes de visite were affordable for the middle classes. Photographers became business people, competing fiercely for clients with promises of better quality, faster turnaround, or more flattering lighting. The industry was so profitable that entire neighborhoods became dominated by photography studios. In Paris, London, and New York, it wasn't unusual to see whole streets devoted to the business of capturing faces. In some ways, these were the world's first image factories, and people flocked to them in droves. As the decades rolled on, cameras and photographs became a fixture of family life. Albums filled with stiff portraits became treasured heirlooms, passed down through generations. Weddings, anniversaries, and even casual moments found their way into the photographic record. But make no mistake, casual didn't mean relaxed. Even as photography became more accessible, sitting for a portrait was still a serious affair. Smiling was rare, partly because long exposure times made it hard to hold a grin without looking like a deranged ventriloquist's dummy. Instead, the default look was solemn dignity, giving us entire generations of family photos that looked like police lineups. Funny angle. Victorian photography gave us the paradox of family fun that looks anything but fun. You can almost hear the kids thinking, "We've been standing here so long, I think I've aged into the next century." The genius of photography's rise was that it turned the idea of immortality into a purchasable good. For a fee, anyone could preserve their likeness beyond the grave, ensuring that future generations could look back and say, "So that's where we got our nose." Studios leaned into this promise, advertising their services as a way to hold on to loved ones forever. And indeed, the photographs that survive from the 19th century remain among the most haunting and moving artifacts of the era. Each stiff pose, each carefully arranged tableau, speaks of the universal human desire to resist time, even if only on a sheet of silver or paper. The irony, of course, is that while photography made memory more vivid, it also cemented the stereotype of the Victorians as stiff, joyless people. In truth, they laughed, cried, and lived as fully as anyone today. But because their photographs demanded stillness, we only see them as statues in black clothing. The technology that captured their humanity also froze them into symbols of solemnity. Cameras turned Victorians into eternal mannequins, forever doomed to look like they'd just received bad news from their butler. By the mid-19th century, photography wasn't just a novelty, a business or a parlor trick. It was a revolution. In the space of a few decades, humanity went from never having seen its true reflection captured with accuracy to suddenly living in a world where moments could be plucked out of time and made eternal. For the first time in history, a soldier, a scientist, or a tourist could look at an image and say, "Yes, I was there," and have proof that no painter's brush or storyteller's exaggeration could distort. Photography didn't just record life, it rewired how society remembered it. One of the most dramatic shifts came in the arena of war. Until photography arrived, the reality of battlefields was usually filtered through paintings or written accounts, which were often more patriotic fantasy than truth. With the arrival of cameras, however, grim reality set in. During the Crimean War and later the American Civil War, photographers like Roger Fenton and Matthew Brady dragged their bulky equipment to the front lines. What they captured wasn't glorious charges or heroic stances, but the stark aftermath, muddy encampments, weary soldiers, and haunting stillness after battle. These weren't grand oil canvases showing noble sacrifice. These were photographs of bodies lying where they had fallen. For the public back home, it was a gut punch. War had never looked so real, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. Photography became a moral mirror, forcing people to confront truths their governments might have preferred to dress up in heroic speeches. But war was only one theatre where photography flexed its power. Travel, too, was transformed. Until then, most people only knew foreign lands through the words of explorers or the interpretive sketches of artists. With photography, suddenly the pyramids, the Great Wall, and the bustling streets of cities thousands of miles away could be seen with astonishing accuracy. For the first time in history, people could prove their vacation happened, instead of just lying about it. Tourists brought home photographs to brag to friends and family, and armchair travelers pored over albums of exotic scenes, building a vision of the world that was no longer mythical but tangible. In an age before airplanes and mass travel, photography was the next best thing to a ticket around the globe. Science, too, embraced photography with open arms. Astronomers pointed lenses at the night sky, capturing craters on the moon and even faint details of distant stars. Biologists used it to preserve images of rare plants, insects, and microscopic structures, creating a permanent record that could be studied across generations. Medicine found its use as well, with doctors documenting conditions, surgeries, and patients. If earlier centuries had relied on the memory and sketching skills of scientists, photography now offered something far more reliable, a direct witness to nature's details. In short, the camera became an ally in humanity's attempt to understand the universe, one glass plate at a time. Journalism was perhaps the field most dramatically altered. Newspapers had long relied on engravings and written reports, but with photography, a new level of credibility emerged. A reporter could claim a protest happened, but a photograph of the crowd made denial impossible. A politician could boast about progress, but a photo of crumbling infrastructure exposed the lie. Photography made truth visible, though, of course, it also paved the way for manipulation and propaganda, a foreshadowing of future battles over what images reveal versus what they conceal. Still, in the 19th century, the sheer novelty of seeing events frozen in time made photography a powerful force in shaping public opinion. For ordinary people, perhaps the greatest change was personal. Family albums began to grow, filled with portraits that told the story of generations. Weddings, birthdays, and gatherings could be preserved not as fading memories but as visual records, available to be shared long after those moments had passed. People could finally see not just themselves but their parents, their children, and even ancestors they had never met. Photography shrank the gap between life and death, allowing faces to survive beyond the grave and families to feel connected across time. Memory was no longer confined to storytelling, it was anchored in visible proof. Of course, photography was not without its critics and skeptics. Some mourned the loss of artistic interpretation, others feared that society would drown in an avalanche of images. Yet, for all the resistance, photography marched forward. It slipped into every corner of life, from science to art, from mourning to celebration, from the battlefield to the living room. The camera became both witness and participant, a silent recorder of everything from the monumental to the mundane. The funny part is that the earliest inventors of the camera obscura could never have imagined how far their little lightbox idea would travel. What began as a glorified shoebox with trust issues about sunlight ended up reshaping how humanity remembered its own existence. In less than a century, photography went from experimental chemistry to a global obsession, from elite studios to family albums, from haunting images of war to smiling group shots in front of landmarks. And whether people were thrilled, terrified, or somewhere in between, one fact was undeniable: the world would never look at itself the same way again. Photography had frozen memory in time. It had created a mirror that never aged, a storyteller that never exaggerated, and a witness that never forgot. The camera wasn't just a machine, it was the birth of a new way of being human, a way of saying we were here, and this is what it looked like. When people think of Napoleon Bonaparte, the first image that comes to mind is usually a short French guy in a funny hat, shouting orders in a thick accent. But peel away the caricature and you'll find someone much stranger, a man whose life was ruled not just by battle strategies and imperial dreams, but also by quirks, routines, and a set of personal habits that make him feel oddly human. Yes, this was the man who reshaped Europe, but he also lived by a set of routines so particular that they would make a modern productivity guru blush. Think of him as the original self-help influencer, only with fewer podcasts and more bayonets. Napoleon's day-to-day life was less glorious emperor and more fussy scheduler. He thrived on routine, demanding that his staff keep his timetable tight enough to make a Swiss watch nervous. His mornings were often chaotic by design. He liked being flooded with reports, dispatches, and letters all at once. He would devour this information, scribbling notes and issuing orders like a caffeinated CEO on a Monday morning. Except, unlike most CEOs, Napoleon's decisions determined whether armies marched or entire nations fell apart. No pressure. But even in his micromanaging brilliance, his eccentricities shone through. He had no patience for long meals, small talk, or ceremonies that dragged on. To Napoleon, wasted time was a personal insult. If he could have invented the microwave to heat his chicken faster, he probably would have. And yet, for a man who hated to waste time, he wasted plenty of it indulging in some very peculiar habits. For example, he obsessed over correspondence, dictating letters at a pace so furious his secretaries often collapsed from exhaustion. Picture a man storming around a room, barking out ideas and commands faster than anyone could keep up, while his assistants sweated bullets trying to turn chaos into legible sentences. The funny part, Napoleon wasn't even that great at spelling or grammar himself. He poured out letters with all the linguistic finesse of a distracted teenager, but he didn't care. To him, speed and impact mattered more than elegance. As long as the message got across, he could live with a few dangling participles. The empire could crumble if he waited for perfect punctuation. And then there was his obsession with naps. Yes, the conqueror of Europe, the man whose strategies are still studied in military academies, could also fall asleep at the drop of a bicorn hat. Napoleon had the uncanny ability to nap anywhere, anytime, and for just long enough to recharge. It's said that he could close his eyes for 15 minutes and wake up ready to direct an entire campaign. Soldiers around him might be stressed, terrified, and shaking from fatigue, while their emperor was snoozing like a toddler in a stroller. This wasn't laziness. Napoleon simply believed in conserving his mental energy like a rechargeable battery. He knew when to flick the switch off, and more importantly, when to flick it back on. He also micromanaged his image just as much as his empire. Napoleon understood branding before branding was a thing. His clothes, his mannerisms, even the way he posed with his hand tucked inside his coat, none of it was accidental. The man knew how to cultivate mystique. He wasn't tall, but he carried himself with such authority that people often described him as larger than life. The short guy insult actually came later, mostly from British propaganda eager to shrink him down to size. In truth, he was about average height for his time, but that didn't stop him from obsessing over how people perceived him. He demanded portraits, busts, and heroic imagery that painted him as the ultimate ruler, half man, half myth, and just a little bit of marketing genius. His quirks extended even further. Napoleon was a compulsive worker who thrived on micromanagement. He didn't just issue broad orders, he wanted to know details about supply lines, soldier rations, and even the quality of horse feed. Imagine running half of Europe while also double-checking how many loaves of bread made it to your troops. He wasn't exactly a big-picture-only guy. He believed victory lived in the details, which might explain why he was both a brilliant strategist and an exhausting boss. And while his grand battles have filled countless history books, the day-to-day Napoleon was a man of strange contradictions. He was both hyper-disciplined and oddly careless, meticulous in some things, and bizarrely lax in others. He could juggle the fate of nations, but he also needed his naps like a cranky preschooler. He expected his staff to keep up with his relentless pace, yet he would stop mid-campaign to obsess over a trivial matter. He was the emperor of Europe, but also the emperor of quirks. In a way, these obsessions helped shape his legend. They made him human in an almost comical sense, because while most rulers are remembered for their crowns, palaces, and pomp, Napoleon is remembered as the man who could run a continent like a tightly wound machine, but still required catnaps and an avalanche of correspondence to function. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was the embodiment of how eccentric habits and rigid routines can coexist with world-changing ambition. The good news: Napoleon's quirks made him oddly relatable. The bad news: if you worked for him, your life was basically one long anxiety attack. When you think of great military leaders, you might imagine sleepless generals pacing back and forth, poring over maps by candlelight, with eyes red from endless hours of worry. Napoleon Bonaparte, not so much. The man could fall asleep faster than a toddler after a sugar crash, and he didn't seem to care where he was when it happened. In a carriage bouncing down muddy French roads, in a drafty military tent, on the battlefield with cannon fire pounding like the world's loudest alarm clock, Napoleon would simply shut his eyes and drift off. For someone who demanded perfection from everyone else, he treated sleep with the casual indifference of a grandpa in a recliner. His staff and soldiers found this both impressive and terrifying. Picture this: you're on campaign, waiting for your emperor to deliver crucial orders, and when you rush into his tent, there he is, out cold, snoring away while Europe's future hangs in the balance. No doubt his officers had to resist the urge to shake him awake and scream, "Napoleon, buddy, maybe save the nap for after the cannonballs stop flying." But to Napoleon, sleep wasn't indulgence, it was weaponized recovery. He had mastered the art of grabbing energy in concentrated bursts, often sleeping for only a few hours a night, and then recharging with quick doses during the day. In a sense, he was practicing polyphasic sleep long before Silicon Valley tried to rebrand it as biohacking. Eyewitnesses described his uncanny ability to fall asleep mid-sentence, then wake minutes later fully alert and ready to dictate complex strategies. Some claimed he could sleep on horseback while his mount plodded forward, a kind of equestrian cruise control. Others said he'd doze in the middle of noisy war councils, surrounded by nervous officers, only to wake up and casually deliver brilliant tactical insights, as if his brain had been running calculations while he snored. It's the kind of trick that made him seem almost superhuman, or at least infuriatingly well-rested. Napoleon's unusual relationship with sleep went hand in hand with his punishing schedule. He often worked deep into the night, dictating letters, reading reports, and plotting maneuvers until dawn. Then, instead of 8 hours of blissful unconsciousness like a normal person, he would collapse for just a few hours, wake up before sunrise, and dive back into the fray. If fatigue caught up to him later, he'd simply crash for a few minutes wherever he happened to be. The battlefield, in Napoleon's world, wasn't just a place for glory, it doubled as his personal bedroom. The sheer brazenness of it astonished people. Soldiers marching into combat would glance at their emperor, slumped in his chair, taking what looked like the least appropriately timed nap in history. But when he woke, it was as if he'd plugged himself into a charger, refreshed, sharp, and brimming with the energy to bark orders that would change the course of wars. His troops came to see this as proof of his steel nerves. After all, if the boss could nap through cannon fire, maybe everything really was under control. Confidence trickled down the chain of command. Napoleon's cat naps became a kind of morale booster. Of course, not everyone admired it. Some contemporaries saw his habit as reckless, even arrogant. How could a man responsible for thousands of lives snooze while chaos unfolded? But Napoleon had no patience for that critique. He insisted he could only lead effectively if his mind was sharp, and for that, short naps were essential. Unlike other commanders who staggered around exhausted and irritable, Napoleon knew when to shut off, even if only for 10 minutes. In modern terms, he was the king of the power nap. The funny part is that his sleep habits carried over into peacetime too. When not at war, he'd still pepper his day with random naps, dozing in chairs, coaches, and even during dull state meetings. If politics bored him, he didn't fake enthusiasm, he just fell asleep. Imagine being a minister nervously delivering a report to the Emperor of the French, only to realize halfway through your speech that he's out cold. It must have been equal parts humiliating and liberating. Modern sleep scientists might actually give Napoleon credit here. Short bursts of rest taken consistently can indeed improve alertness and decision-making. In fact, his schedule mirrors advice often given to high-performance professionals today. Don't obsess over long sleep, just ensure you recover strategically. But leave it to Napoleon to stumble into modern neuroscience centuries early. The legend of Napoleon's battlefield naps spread far and wide, contributing to his aura of invincibility. He was the man who could command armies, redraw maps, and still catch a few Zeds while cannonballs flew overhead. His soldiers, who marched until their feet bled and rarely got more than scraps of sleep, must have looked at him with both awe and bitter envy. If only their commander could share his magical ability to fall asleep anywhere, they might have been less cranky about those endless campaigns. And perhaps, on some level, Napoleon's napping was a kind of psychological weapon. Enemies who heard tales of him calmly sleeping on the eve of battle might have thought, what kind of lunatic is so confident he can nap while we're plotting his destruction? Whether intentional or not, those naps became part of his myth. He was not just a general, he was a man who could bend the very rhythms of life to his will. The good news? Napoleon showed the world the power of a well-timed nap. The bad news? If you ever worked for him, you had to explain to the troops that the emperor isn't ignoring you, he's just recharging. When we picture Napoleon Bonaparte, we often imagine him in a crisp military uniform, hand tucked into his jacket, staring dramatically off into the distance, like he's posing for the world's most awkward album cover. But beneath the sharp bicorn hat and medals, Napoleon's relationship with fashion, hygiene, and scent was peculiar. This was not a man who simply woke up, threw on some breeches, and marched off to conquer Europe. No, Napoleon approached his wardrobe and his body with habits so eccentric that they've become legendary in their own right. Let's begin with his love affair with gloves. Napoleon adored them with the kind of enthusiasm that borders on obsession. He owned dozens, maybe hundreds of pairs in different colors and styles, made from the finest materials. To Napoleon, gloves weren't just accessories, they were extensions of his authority. He wore them almost constantly, as if ruling an empire bare-handed was far too pedestrian. There are even accounts of him gifting gloves to people as though they were sacred relics. Imagine being handed a sweaty glove by Napoleon and being expected to treasure it forever. That's the kind of bizarre fashion cult he cultivated. But gloves were just the beginning. Napoleon was also notorious for his love of cologne, though love might be an understatement. He practically bathed in the stuff. His favorite was a concoction known as eau de cologne, made of citrus oils, rosemary, and alcohol. It was designed to be dabbed lightly on the skin, but Napoleon wasn't exactly into moderation. He is said to have gone through multiple bottles a month. dousing himself so thoroughly that he often smelled like a walking orange grove on fire. His valet claimed the emperor used so much cologne that his quarters reeked of it, with the fragrance seeping into clothes, upholstery, and probably the walls themselves. The problem? No amount of citrus perfume could fully mask Napoleon's other habits. His bathing routines were unconventional, to put it mildly. Napoleon enjoyed long, scalding baths, sometimes lasting hours, where he would soak until he resembled a boiled dumpling. He believed hot water kept him healthy and restored his energy, so he often ordered tubs prepared at odd hours. His servants must have been perpetually annoyed, running back and forth with buckets while their emperor sat in steaming luxury. And while he liked to bathe, his standards of overall hygiene were confusing. He could obsess over one aspect of cleanliness while neglecting another, leaving contemporaries scratching their heads. For instance, Napoleon didn't always bother changing clothes regularly. He'd sometimes wear the same outfit for days, even weeks, especially on campaign. One British observer sneered that he often looked disheveled, with his stockings wrinkled and his uniform smeared. So here we have a paradox. The same man who drenched himself in gallons of cologne also stomped around in rumpled gear that probably smelled less like citrus and more like damp soldier. His fashion sense, in other words, was an odd balancing act between refinement and complete disregard. Another curious detail was his love of snuff, the finely ground tobacco that people inhaled for a quick buzz. Napoleon was a devoted snuff user, carrying ornate snuff boxes wherever he went. He would tap and sniff constantly, to the point where it became one of his defining personal habits. His collection of snuff boxes was massive, some plain, others bejeweled, because even his tobacco addiction had to be dressed for court. If he wasn't gripping a sword or a quill, chances are he was clutching a snuff box. His soldiers may have idolized his military genius, but they also had to watch their emperor sneeze like a man possessed. And then there's the soap story. Napoleon reportedly preferred simple soaps and disliked anything overly perfumed. This was odd given his drowning in cologne tendencies, but consistency wasn't exactly his strong suit. Some anecdotes suggest he wasn't too picky about washing himself thoroughly either, preferring a long soak to actual scrubbing. Think of it less as hygiene and more as lounging with bubbles. His enemies, naturally, seized on this and spread rumors that Napoleon stank, a convenient way to demean a man already dominating Europe. British propaganda gleefully painted him as smelly, unkempt, and effeminate, even as he was drowning himself in bottles of citrus-scented cologne. Yet, despite the contradictions, Napoleon's fashion and hygiene quirks mattered because they added to his mystique. His gloves signaled refinement, his cologne became a kind of signature aura, and his hours in the bath showed he valued ritual as much as conquest. His habits made him human, but also oddly untouchable. Who else could command armies by day and then spend 3 hours soaking like a spa enthusiast by night? His court adapted to these quirks, tolerating the overpowering smell of oranges and rosemary while praising his elegance. The irony is delicious. Here was the most feared man in Europe, the bogeyman of monarchies, whose empire rose and fell in a storm of battles, and yet he also smelled like a perfume shop that lost a fight with a wet dog. His eccentricities didn't weaken his image. If anything, they made him unforgettable. Every general wore a uniform, but only Napoleon paired his with clouds of cologne, endless gloves, and an obsession with hot baths. He made fashion and hygiene another battlefield, one where his weirdness won the day. The good news? Napoleon always left a strong impression. The bad news? That impression sometimes burned your nostrils before he even walked into the room. If Napoleon Bonaparte had lived today, there's no doubt he would have been the type to send an alarming number of texts, half of them brilliant, half of them questionable, and all of them way too personal. Lucky for history, he didn't have a smartphone. Unlucky for Josephine, his wife, he had a pen, paper, and absolutely no filter. Napoleon's love letters to Josephine are a treasure trove of romance, longing, insecurity, and, let's be honest, way too much information. They reveal not just a general and emperor, but a man whose emotions were as chaotic as his battlefields. Napoleon met Josephine, then a widow with 2 children, in 1795. and he fell head over heels with the intensity of a cannon blast. From the moment their affair began, his letters poured out like a flood. He wrote with a sense of urgency, as if the ink might dry before his passion did. They're filled with declarations of love so dramatic they could make Shakespeare roll his eyes. Napoleon didn't just say, "I miss you." He wrote things like, "Since I left you, I have been constantly depressed. My happiness is to be near you. I live only for you." Subtlety, not exactly his strong suit. But here's where things take a turn from romantic to, well, awkward. Napoleon didn't just confess his feelings, he confessed everything. In one infamous letter, he instructed Josephine not to bathe before he returned home from campaign. Yes, you heard that right. He wanted her natural scent preserved for him, which tells us two things. First, Napoleon had a very specific idea of intimacy, and second, he probably didn't consult a public health expert before putting pen to paper. For Josephine, this must have been one of those moments when you put the letter down, sigh, and wonder whether conquering Europe has finally fried your husband's brain. And it wasn't just hygiene. Napoleon's letters often bounced between romantic declarations and petty jealousies. If Josephine didn't respond quickly enough, he spiraled into suspicion. He demanded reassurances of her love, sometimes sounding more like an insecure teenager than the Emperor of the French. This is the same man who could face down coalitions of nations, yet he was reduced to a bundle of nerves if Josephine went quiet for a day. Imagine running an empire while also panicking that your wife hasn't written back in 48 hours. It's both endearing and slightly ridiculous. Of course, Josephine wasn't entirely innocent in all this. While Napoleon was obsessively faithful in his letters, at least early on, she had her own affairs while he was away on campaign, and the news of her infidelity hit him like grape shot to the chest. His letters turned bitter, hurt, and almost desperate, as though he couldn't quite reconcile the emperor in him with the humiliated husband. At one point, he told her bluntly that her betrayal had left him crushed, but even then, he couldn't stop writing to her. Love, for Napoleon, was a battlefield far messier than Austerlitz. His oversharing didn't stop at the personal either. Napoleon sometimes peppered his letters with complaints about his health, his exhaustion, and even minor ailments. He wrote to Josephine about his headaches, his irritability, and his need for rest. He wasn't trying to be stoic. He wanted her to know every detail. These letters remind us that beneath the imperial uniform was a man who desperately wanted someone to care about his weaknesses. To modern readers, it feels almost like scrolling through a social media account where someone shares a little too much about their daily struggles. Napoleon was, in his own way, live blogging his emotions before live blogging was a thing. And then there's the sheer frequency of his letters. He wrote constantly, sometimes several times a day, as though he couldn't breathe without reminding Josephine how much he adored her, or how suspicious he was of her silence. The flood of ink created a strange kind of intimacy. For Josephine, this must have been both flattering and exhausting. On the one hand, your husband is Europe's most powerful man, pouring his heart out for you. On the other, you now have a stack of letters demanding answers, and somewhere in there he's instructed you to stop bathing. Talk about mixed emotions. Historians love these letters because they pull back the curtain on Napoleon the man, rather than Napoleon the myth. Here we see someone intensely vulnerable, needy, passionate, and flawed. His reputation as a brilliant strategist often overshadows the fact that he was also, quite simply, a man who loved recklessly and wrote recklessly. His pen was as relentless as his armies marching forward, taking no prisoners and leaving Josephine to sort through the wreckage. The funny part is that Napoleon's legacy as a lover is defined as much by these embarrassing overshares as by his passionate devotion. He didn't just invent grandiose declarations of love, he also accidentally pioneered the art of sending your partner messages that are just a little too honest. He might not have been the first emperor of Europe, but he was arguably the first emperor of TMI. The good news? Napoleon's letters show us that even the greatest conqueror in Europe could be reduced to mush by love. The bad news? He basically invented oversharing centuries before social media, and poor Josephine had to be his only follower. Napoleon Bonaparte, may have commanded armies with brilliant tactics, reshaped Europe, and crowned himself emperor, but when it came to certain habits, he was more like a medieval knight clinging to a rabbit's foot than a rational Enlightenment-era ruler. Yes, the man who crushed coalitions and dictated treaties had his own set of battlefield good luck charms, chief among them his legendary bicorn hat and a few favorite coats that he wore until they looked like they had survived more wars than some of his soldiers. Let's be honest, camouflage was not his strong suit. Other generals tried to blend into the scenery, riding horses in neutral colors and wearing practical uniforms that wouldn't scream, "Shoot me, I'm the guy in charge." Napoleon, on the other hand, strolled into battle wearing his distinctive hat tilted sideways like it was his personal logo, and often in his trademark grey overcoat. If you were a sniper trying to identify the enemy commander, Napoleon basically saved you the trouble. There he is, the one dressed like Napoleon. It's a miracle he wasn't picked off more often. But to him, those garments weren't just clothing, they were talismans, extensions of his confidence and symbols of his power. The bicorn hat in particular became synonymous with him. Napoleon wore it not side to front like most officers, but side to side, making him stand out instantly. Only about a dozen of his original hats survive today, and each is worth a small fortune, but during his lifetime he owned around 120 of them. Why so many? Because he wore them constantly, in sun and rain, in victory and retreat. Soldiers joked that his hat saw more action than half the army. He wasn't sentimental about most possessions, but when it came to his hats, he was fiercely particular. Once, when a valet brought him the wrong hat, Napoleon scolded him with the kind of anger you'd expect if the man had misplaced a cannon. Then there was the greatcoat, a simple grey wool garment that became so famous it might as well have had its own rank. This coat wasn't fashionable, nor was it meant to impress foreign dignitaries, but Napoleon believed it brought him luck and authority on the battlefield. It was the uniform of destiny. When soldiers saw him in that coat, morale soared. It was as if the fabric had absorbed all his victories and carried them into the next campaign. His superstition wasn't private either. The coat and hat were part of his theatre of leadership, almost like stage props in the grand drama of war. But his rituals didn't stop at fashion. Napoleon was famously superstitious in general, a trait that seems odd for a man who supposedly relied on cold calculation and logic. He carried lucky charms, consulted oracles, and placed bizarre faith in omens. Before battles, he would sometimes spend long moments in silence, as if waiting for fate to whisper in his ear. His aides recorded that he had lucky coins he kept close, and he occasionally hesitated to embark on journeys if he had seen what he considered a bad sign. Rationality guided his strategies, yes, but in the quiet corners of his mind, chance and charm mattered too. His soldiers noticed. Some found it amusing, others inspiring. After all, if the boss thought his old grey coat would guarantee victory, who were they to argue? It's easy to dismiss such quirks, but Napoleon wasn't unique in this. Many great leaders had their battlefield rituals. Alexander the Great wore sacred armor, Julius Caesar consulted augurs, and George Washington carried lucky trinkets. Napoleon's twist was that his sacred objects looked like ordinary clothing, but once they were on him, they became relics of confidence. Of course, the irony is that superstition can backfire by making himself so recognizable in his lucky gear. Napoleon also made himself a very obvious target. Yet perhaps his sheer audacity shielded him. Enemies hesitated to believe that the man so visible, so seemingly exposed, could really be the emperor himself. After all, what kind of general would make himself a walking bullseye? Napoleon, apparently. His superstitions also extended to timing. He was known to delay events or issue commands at odd hours, guided by instinct that sometimes veered into ritual. If a battle was meant to start at dawn but something felt wrong, Napoleon could stall, as if waiting for fate to align. His generals learned to trust these whims, even when they didn't understand them, because more often than not, things went his way. Was it military genius? Probably. Was it also the placebo effect of believing in lucky hats and coats? Maybe a little of both. And those hats, well, they became immortal symbols. After Waterloo, when his empire crumbled, one of his hats was captured by the Prussians and later displayed as a trophy. It was like stripping Superman of his cape. The object wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was Napoleon condensed into cloth and thread. Even in defeat, the hat held power, not militarily, but symbolically. People who had never met him still believed his hat carried some essence of the man himself. So while history books remember Napoleon for his codes, conquests, and coronations, there's another legacy. The image of a small figure on a battlefield, grey coat flapping in the wind, iconic bicorn hat tilted sideways, standing as a beacon to his troops and a dare to his enemies. Superstition may not win wars, but in Napoleon's case, it helped build a legend. And if you think about it, his lucky hat might just be the most successful piece of military gear ever stitched together. It wasn't bulletproof, it wasn't camouflaged, but it was unforgettable. And sometimes in war, that's all you need. When you picture an emperor at dinner, you might imagine gold-plated cutlery, mountains of delicacies, and enough wine to float a battleship. Now erase that picture completely, because Napoleon Bonaparte at the table was, well, disappointing. For a man who obsessed over strategy, inspired armies, and micromanaged the smallest details of his empire, his eating habits were shockingly careless. Food wasn't a pleasure for him, it was a pit stop. His dinners weren't banquets but speed trials, and his companions often ended up chewing dust while Napoleon had already scarfed down his plate and marched back to work. Let's start with speed. Napoleon ate like a man late for a meeting, which, to be fair, he usually was. Eyewitnesses describe him inhaling food with alarming haste, barely chewing before moving on. A whole chicken could disappear in minutes. It wasn't elegance, it was efficiency, as though he treated meals the way a soldier treats rations, fuel for the machine, not an art form. Guests unlucky enough to dine with him had two options: either keep up with the emperor's frantic fork pace, or sit there awkwardly while he abandoned the table, leaving them with their untouched soup and a sense of existential confusion. His cook, Dunand, must have had one of the most thankless jobs in Europe. This was a man capable of producing elaborate French cuisine, the pride of Europe, but his most powerful client couldn't care less. Napoleon often ignored complex dishes in favor of the simplest fare: roast chicken, potatoes, lentils, plain pasta, and whatever was on hand. He wasn't a gourmet, he was a culinary minimalist. If you put truffles, fine sauces, or pâté before him, chances were high he would barely notice. In fact, he sometimes walked away mid-meal, leaving food half-eaten, because an idea had struck him. Strategy first, stomach second, and his table manners? Let's just say, Marie Antoinette would have fainted. Napoleon had no patience for dining rituals. He was sloppy, careless, and often messy. His napkin skills were questionable, and there are accounts of him dripping food onto his famous grey coat. He wasn't trying to impress anyone at the dinner table. In fact, he seemed annoyed at the very idea of mealtimes interrupting his grand designs. Dining with him must have felt less like an elegant soiree, and more like grabbing a rushed lunch break with your boss at a gas station diner. But what Napoleon lacked in refinement, he made up for in odd quirks. For example, he adored roast chicken to the point of obsession. Soldiers joked that if Napoleon had been forced to choose between conquering Europe or a perfectly cooked bird, the decision might have taken him longer than usual. He also had a sweet tooth. Though in typical Napoleon fashion, he didn't savor dessert, he devoured it. Candy, fruit pastes, and almond sweets often disappeared faster than a Prussian battalion at Austerlitz. Wine, however, was not his passion. Despite being French, Napoleon was no oenophile. He drank sparingly, often diluting his wine with water until it was little more than grape-flavored juice. Strong spirits held no appeal to him. Unlike many rulers who used drinking as a form of bonding, Napoleon avoided drunkenness at all costs. Control was everything to him, even if it meant being the only sober man in a room full of generals cheerfully singing after supper. Interestingly, while food wasn't a pleasure, it was sometimes a problem. Napoleon had a famously delicate stomach. Digestive troubles plagued him, leading to constant complaints of cramps, heartburn, and indigestion. Some historians suggest his lifelong gastric woes influenced not just his health but also his famously short temper. Imagine trying to run a continent while battling acid reflux. It explains a lot. His solution was not dietary refinement but rather ignoring the problem entirely, powering through meals as quickly as possible, and then diving back into work before his stomach could object. On campaign, his eating habits grew even stranger. While his soldiers often starved or waited for rations, Napoleon survived on whatever could be prepared in minutes. He was known to grab food with his fingers directly from pans or eat cold leftovers without complaint. One aide recalled him polishing off a roast chicken on horseback, like some kind of galloping fast food customer. Another story tells of him absent-mindedly eating half-burnt bread from a campfire and declaring it perfectly good. For a man who demanded perfection in nearly every other aspect of life, when it came to food, he seemed content with mediocrity. But Napoleon did occasionally recognize the symbolic power of dining. Banquets after victories were opportunities for political theater, yet even then, while others lingered over fine dishes and conversation, Napoleon often left early. Diplomats and dignitaries sat sipping wine while the emperor dashed off to scribble battle plans or reorganize a ministry. Food was useful for others, it built morale, it dazzled allies. But for Napoleon himself, it remained a chore. If there's a funny irony here, it's that Napoleon's table, which could have been a stage for indulgence and image building, became instead an extension of his personality. Restless, pragmatic, and oddly unglamorous. He wasn't seduced by cuisine, and he didn't indulge in endless courses like so many monarchs before him. While Louis XIV spent hours at banquets dripping with decadence, Napoleon lived on fast bites and roast chicken. So yes, he conquered Europe, but he ate like a man racing the clock at a truck stop. His eating style made prison cafeteria dining look like fine etiquette. In the end, perhaps his approach to food mirrored his approach to life itself. Quick, decisive, and never distracted by the frills. The emperor might not have had a taste for gastronomy, but he had an appetite for empire, and unfortunately for his cooks, that always came first. When we think of Napoleon Bonaparte, we usually picture him as the conqueror of Europe, the mastermind of battles, the man with one hand mysteriously tucked inside his jacket. But peel away the layers of myth, propaganda, and oil paintings, and you find a man who was, quite frankly, delightfully odd. His quirks were not just side notes in his biography, they became part of his legend, humanizing a figure who might otherwise appear impossibly distant. For an emperor who demanded absolute order on the battlefield, his personal life was a jumble of habits, obsessions, and eccentricities that made him weirdly relatable. Take his sleep, for instance. Napoleon's ability to nap anywhere at any time on a battlefield, during travel, in the middle of planning a campaign was both his superpower and his punchline. It meant he could stretch his working hours longer than most humans, giving him the energy to outthink his rivals. Yet it also painted the image of a world conqueror who functioned like a cranky toddler that just needed a blanket and a quiet corner. His soldiers may have marched for miles, but their general could collapse into a doze at the drop of a bicorn hat. Then there were his hygiene and fashion rituals, his fondness for gloves, his baths that were more performance than practicality, and his oceans of cologne turned him into a walking contradiction. He was a man who controlled entire nations, but couldn't control the fact that he smelled like a perfumery, having a nervous breakdown. For his contemporaries, this created an odd tension. How could the most powerful man in Europe be so careless about basic cleanliness, yet so obsessive about certain accessories? It was baffling, comical, and endearing all at once. His letters to Josephine also cemented him as more than just a cold strategist. They revealed a man with passions, insecurities, and an extraordinary lack of filter. Napoleon the Emperor could rewrite laws and redraw maps, but Napoleon the husband was out here begging Josephine not to bathe before he returned. It was equal parts romantic, awkward, and disturbing. In these oversharing moments, we glimpse not the iron-fisted general, but the vulnerable, very human man behind the title. If social media had existed in 1800, Napoleon would have been the king of TMI posts. Even his superstitions, like his lucky hats and coats, told a story. Napoleon wasn't just relying on rational strategy and mathematics. He also leaned on ritual. For a man who embodied the age of reason, he was oddly attached to irrational comforts. His lucky attire became as recognizable as his strategies, making him instantly visible to friend and foe alike. Soldiers found reassurance in his eccentricities, because if their general wore the right hat, perhaps victory was assured. Superstition might not have won battles, but it shaped morale, and morale often decided outcomes. And then, of course, his eating habits. Napoleon didn't feast like a king. He inhaled food like a man trying to win a contest against time itself. Meals were not moments of leisure, but interruptions to be endured. He demolished chickens, scarved sweets, and guzzled watered-down wine, leaving his dinner guests bewildered and slightly offended. It wasn't glamorous, but it revealed his restless spirit. Napoleon simply couldn't sit still long enough to savor life's flavors. In an odd way, his careless dining habits reflected his entire approach. Everything was about speed, momentum, and pushing forward, whether it was devouring a roast or reorganizing Europe. All of these quirks combined to make Napoleon less of a marble statue and more of a flesh-and-blood person. They stripped away some of the grandeur and left us with a portrait of a man who was both extraordinary and embarrassingly normal. Yes, he could redraw the map of Europe with his armies, but he could also fall asleep in a chair mid-sentence, drown himself in cologne, or demand strange rituals from his wife. He was a genius, a tyrant, a visionary, and also a bundle of odd little routines that would make even the most ordinary person nod in recognition. That's perhaps why Napoleon endures not just as a historical figure, but as a cultural character. He wasn't perfect, in fact he was wonderfully imperfect. His quirks made him approachable in a way that few emperors or kings ever managed to be. He wasn't just a man who built an empire, he was a man who proved that even at the height of power, you'll never conquer your weird little routines. The funny thing about legacy is that it doesn't just rest on triumphs or failures, but on the small details that make a figure memorable. Napoleon's quirks turned him into something larger than life, while simultaneously making him profoundly human. And maybe that's the real secret. Not every emperor can dominate Europe, but every person knows what it's like to have strange habits that define them. Napoleon just happened to carry his into history, along with his lucky hat, his chicken bones, and his bottomless supply of cologne.